Dark Memories, Fae Wilds Series, Book 9, written by W.J. May, narrated by Kathleen Starr Hall. Chapter 13. Windy inserted himself between the enraged waitress and Hollie, a crackling blue shield appearing around his body. It absorbed the demoness's blow, but the action only seemed to make her madder. She let out a growl and pushed the bot out of her way, then rushed at Hollie once again. Fear drenched Hollie, and she skidded backwards, ignoring the bodies she bumped into. Any moment now, I'm either going to get my block knocked off, or Samael is going to figure out that I'm the one causing this ruckus. She had to find a way out of the situation, and quickly. "Windy, we've got to get out of here now," she yelled, then turned to flee and ran right into a wall of hard muscle. Looking up, Hollie realized she was pressed against the chest of one irate vampire. "A bar brawl? Really?" he said, then grabbed her, swiveling quickly to move her out of the way of the attacking demoness. The waitress was not to be denied her prey, however, and she quickly launched herself onto Maz's back. The vampire stiffened, then let out a growl. He grabbed the woman's arm and flipped her over so that she was suddenly standing on the other side of him. She blinked in confusion and whirled around to face the vampire again, a fist flying toward his face, but Maz was too quick for her. "Stop attempting to strike me, or I'll be forced to restrain you," he warned. The demoness refused to listen, so Maz snatched the belt off a passing demon and yanked her hands behind her back, winding the belt around her wrists. "There!" he said, giving her a shove away from him. Focusing his attention on Hollie once again, he gave her a telling look. "Let's get out of here before I have to take down everyone in this bar." Windy's small hand grabbed hers, and they made a beeline for the exit. The scene behind her had descended into chaos, and as they fled, Hollie could hear the sounds of blows landing and glass breaking. Well, I suppose it could have gone worse, she thought, feeling an inch away from hysteria. Once outside the door, Hollie was careful to avoid the puke puddle. She sidled down the building's face, then paused in front of the storefront next door that was dark and silent. Maz was at her side a second later, his hand latching onto her arm. "What in the world did you think you were doing?" he asked, his expression incredulous. "And how did you make it out of the keep? You were locked in my quarters." Hollie shrugged, pretending it had been as easy as blinking. "I didn't feel like hanging around that old place all night. I figured it might be fun to get out and meet people." "You were looking for a ride out of Pluto," he contradicted her. "Didn't you stop to think that the moment you had a demon take you off-world, you'd be breaking your unbreakable vow?" "Is there really any way out of this situation that doesn't involve breaking the vow?" she countered. "I saw a chance to escape, and I took it." Her old friend anger was back again, and it wouldn't be denied. "As a matter of fact, I think we would have pulled off our plan if you hadn't interrupted us." "Are you kidding me? If I hadn't shown up when I did, that demoness would have had you for lunch." "You can run along," she said dismissively, waving her hand at him. "We don't need any assistance." Maz failed to suppress a groan. "Hollie, you can't be serious. I know you're angry, but you've got to stop running off half-cocked like this." "Why should I? Your man Samael must be distracted, or he isn't very observant because he sent no one after us. We could be off Pluto in less than an hour if you'd shut up and get out of our way." "Samael is fond of giving his prisoners enough rope to hang themselves," Maz replied. "Just ask the imp. Or have you forgotten him already?" "How could I? At this point, Dallin is pretty much my hero. He's no longer in a dungeon rotting on Pluto, is he? For all intents and purposes, he's escaped Samael. So maybe I should take a page out of the imp's book and ditch Samael at the first opportunity." Maz shook his head. "Dallin will show up again sooner or later, mark my words. And Samael will be sure to dole out the punishment the imp so richly deserves. The prince keeps tabs on everyone. I know that now more than ever, considering how easily he found my pocket realm." "Not my problem," she said, pushing past him. "Windy, why don't you find us another tavern? This one a little less rowdy?" The bot followed her down the street, scanning the area. "I have detected several establishments that furnish alcohol, but I cannot determine their state of unruliness," he told her after a moment. "You can't be serious," Maz called out, then hurried to her side. "Hollie, please stop this foolishness. I hear you loud and clear, and I'm happy to discuss options for getting off-world, but you are in a dangerous realm. There are plenty of creatures who would love the opportunity to catch a defenseless human and use her for their own nefarious purposes." "What, like drinking my blood?" she said, aiming her words like a punch. Low blow, he grumbled, shaking his head. I'm beginning to feel like you have no respect for me at all. She could hear the hurt in his voice, but her frustration with the vampire outweighed her sympathy. Really? Says the vamp who stalked me, tried to get rid of my friends, kept things from me, and forced me into this impossible situation. Have you shown a shred of respect for me throughout this whole mess? He stared at her, a mix of emotions on his face. You must understand, the realm I come from is a perilous place, and the only mentor I had is a cruel, manipulative, power-hungry maniac, and that's putting it mildly. Maz put a hand on her arm, his expression turning serious. When I first came upon you and learned what you were, that you were my mate, I admit, I did not behave as I should, but I have been trying hard to do better. But we need to move beyond our past and consider our future, which means you'll have to decide whether you can forgive me my past transgressions and assume that my intentions toward you are positive. Consider our future. She shook her head. His words were penetrating, but she still felt like there was a disconnect. That's what I'm trying to do. You are the one encouraging me to get off Pluto. Otherwise, we have no future. But when I try and do something about it, you block me at every turn. We need to get on the same page, vampire, or else we'll never stop butting heads. And we'll never get away from Samael. It took him a moment to nod. Agreed. Now please, come back with me to the keep. I have an idea I want to talk about. Talk. Talking just means more delays, she shook her head. I'm sorry, but it's time to take action. Hollie set off down the street again, not willing to trap herself once again in the locked room while Maz tried to extract them from this mess all on his own. For this brief moment, she had some agency, and she didn't want to lose it. She headed down the block, Windy using his jets to keep pace. She turned back to see Maz standing in place, shaking his head and mumbling to himself. Maybe I should go back like he says. Heaven knows I could use some sleep and a hot meal. We could talk about his idea and try to mend the rift growing between us. Then she saw him turn in her direction, his characteristic bossy expression appearing on his face. Hollie! Come back here! Ignoring him, she turned a corner and nearly plowed into a cloaked figure approaching from the opposite direction. Oops, she said. Sorry about that. The cloaked figure seemed to size her up, then paused to listen as Maz called to her again. I don't care if you like it or not. We're going back to my quarters, he grumbled, marching toward her. Before Hollie could respond, the cloaked figure lifted an arm to reveal what looked like a crooked twig. It was aimed in Maz's direction, and Hollie watched as a tendril of what appeared to be black smoke arose from the twig's tip and shot down the street, hitting Maz in the chest. The vampire stopped his advance, his face confused. Hollie watched him, realizing a few seconds later that he wasn't moving at all. Maz had become a statue, frozen in the middle of the street. Her jaw dropped, and she turned back to the cloaked figure. They always think they can drag us home to their beds whether we want it or not, came a clear female voice from beneath the cloak's hood. Maybe that will teach him a lesson. Dark hands reached up to push back the hood and expose the speaker's face. Her skin was dark blue, traced with black, her features humanoid save for the small pointed horns coming from her temples and the pair of fangs on display when she smiled. Malefia at your service, she said with a small bow. Hollie. She wasn't sure how to respond to the creature. Looking back at Maz, she felt bad that the misunderstanding had led to him being subject to a stranger's magic. He's really not the bad sort, she said after a moment. He just doesn't have much experience with relationships. At least the kind that lasts longer than a draining, Malefia said with a glance toward Maz, then turned her attention back to Hollie. What I'm really interested in is learning just how a human got mixed up with Samael's right-hand leech. Chapter 14. Are you certain he'll be okay out there? Hollie was standing in the doorway to Malefia's shop, watching the motionless Maz a few yards away. The creature had invited her in for a chat, and too surprised to turn her down, Hollie had followed her back to the shop. He's fine, the woman replied, waving a hand distractedly before removing her cloak and turning to hang it on a hook inside the door. Hollie hopped back a step when she realized there was a pair of blue, bat-like wings on her back. They were small, reminding Hollie of a Halloween costume. She tried not to make it obvious that she was staring, but when Malefia turned around and caught her expression, she laughed. You like the wings? They're a gift from my father's side of the family. She gestured for Hollie and Windy to follow her, then walked into the shop. Hollie fell in step behind her, scanning the shelves of merchandise. There were stacks upon stacks of jars, each carefully labeled in a curly script. Hollie read as she walked, eyes squinting. Most of the words were gibberish, but the ones she could make out were exactly what she would have expected from a magical shop. Plump slugs, eye of toad, wormwood, mushroom, amphibian slime. Hollie passed a large jar filled with a lime green liquid and shook her head. I don't even want to guess what that one is. Goblin snot? How about some tea? Malefia called. She ducked behind the counter that ran across the back wall, then pulled out a copper teapot. With a wave of a twig-like wand, she released the pot into the air, where it hovered. Another wave of the wand, and a small fire appeared below it. I've got mint, black, or moonflower, she said, shaking a row of tin tea canisters. What's moonflower? Hollie asked, still feeling a little shaken. She had to resist the urge to keep going back and checking on Maz. You haven't had it? Oh, you'll love it. She opened the canister and pulled out 2 small white flowers with black centers. Popping them into twin mugs, waving her wand again, she brought the teapot to the cups and poured steaming water into the mugs. Hollie approached the counter, watching the process while Windy hovered by her side. I forgot to make one for you, Malefia said, addressing the robot for the first time. Can you drink anything? I'm not sure I see a mouth. No, thank you, Windy replied politely. Although I must ask about our companion. What exactly have you done to him? Malefia casually shrugged a shoulder. A fairly simple spell, though I never expected to catch Mazik the Merciless off guard enough to be caught by pedestrian magic like mine. Can you take it off him? Hollie asked, distracted by the sweet smell of the tea. It's like cotton candy and caramel and toffee and whipped cream and pumpkin spice and peppermint all melted together in a non-disgusting, utterly delightful way. Putting her elbows on the counter and leaning in, Malefia nodded. Sure, any time. But are you sure you're in a rush to have him back? It looked to me like you could use a break. Unable to resist the tempting odor any longer, Hollie took a cup and lifted it to her lips. The moment the tea touched her tongue, she was transported to a heavenly realm of sweet satisfaction. This tea is amazing. Knew you'd like it, Malefia said, not yet taking up her own cup. Humans go crazy for it, which is why I'm a fan myself. But you're not. Hollie stopped herself, not wanting to be rude. Human? You're only half right. Malefia straightened, flexing her little wings. I'm a Cambion, half demon, half human. All woman. Hollie giggled, then took another sip of tea that ended with her emptying the cup. She set it back on the counter, a forlorn expression on her face. Malefia laughed. Here, you can have mine. She watched as Hollie waved the aroma to her face, took a big breath, then sighed in pleasure. How does a human woman... Hollie could manage to finish the thought, but the Cambion caught her adrift regardless. My mother had an adventurous spirit, and my father, well, he was a charmer. Malefia's carefree expression grew heavy for a moment. I've seen him a couple of times. The type that always has a woman on his arm. Mom, however, never got over him. I'm sorry, Hollie said, setting the cup down. I lost my mother when I was young, and my father mourned her for the rest of his life. I guess true love is like that. Malefia gave her a small smile. I suppose it is. I actually came to Pluto to find my father and give him a stern talking to for abandoning us, but he's always one step ahead. Besides, there are a lot of demons on Pluto, which complicates trying to locate one in particular. She looked Hollie over. Humans, on the other hand, are rare on Pluto. You might be the only one I've ever seen here, in fact. Guess I'm special. She picked up the cup and took another sip of the tea, forcing herself to drink slowly and savor the flavor. Special indeed to come to Pluto with a powerful vampire. You look like you could use some help, so I stepped in. That's what I do. Help out other humans. At least one half of me does. She gave Hollie a crooked grin. Humans are way better than demons. They do seem like a rough bunch, Hollie agreed, swallowing another small sip. Malefia's smile vanished. Demons suck. They're not so approving of my kind. Half-breeds are considered weak, useless, less than. Sounds like a bunch of bullies to me. I hate bullies. Hollie leaned against the counter, some of the tightness in her chest melting away. There was something about the Cambion that put her at ease. I thought Maz was a bully. At first, he just wouldn't leave me alone. I ran from him. World after world, I ran from him, but he always came after me. Sounds like you could have used a wand like mine, Malefia said, making Hollie laugh. It would have come in handy, not gonna lie, she replied. But the truth is, he grew on me. After a while, when he calmed down a little, I realized he didn't want to hurt me. He just needed to be around me. Her host arched a dark eyebrow. You don't say. I do, Hollie said, giggling. She felt a little lightheaded, but chalked it up to her excitement of being able to interact with another human, even if she was only half human. He insists he's my mate, but humans don't have mates, right? My mother might argue that point, Malefia said, then pushed the mug in Hollie's direction. Don't let it get cold. There was a sound from outside the shop's open door, a sort of skittering sound, followed by low, guttural laughter. Wendy sailed off to investigate, and Hollie, remembering the defenseless vamp, took a few steps in the bot's direction. He's fine, Malefia said, calling her back. This tea, however, has a very short shelf life. She used her wand to float it toward her. Hollie plucked it from the air and took another long sniff, closing her eyes at the aroma's decadence. You may want to see this, Wendy called from the door. Hollie moved to the door to see 3 small lizardmen circling the vampire, who was still frozen in the center of the street. They were poking at Maz to see if he would move. Then Hollie saw one's hand move inside his jacket, rifling in Maz's pockets. Hey, you! Get away from him! She shouted out the door. The 3 lizardmen froze, then scattered, disappearing into the shadows. Hollie giggled again, turning back toward the counter when Wendy suddenly bumped into her. He jostled her arm, causing her to drop the mug. It shattered against the stone floor. Oh, no! Hollie said, lifting a hand to her mouth in embarrassment. I'm so sorry. Don't worry about it, Malefia said with an easy manner. She waved her wand in the mess's direction, and the shards started to pick themselves up and float away. I'll get another mug and boil up some more tea. Be right back. The Cambion disappeared through a curtain behind the counter. Wendy tapped on Hollie's arm, coming closer. There's something in the drink. My scans failed to identify the agent, but there's definitely something in there. Something in the tea? Hollie shook her head, then braced herself on a nearby shelf. I do feel a little drunk, she noted, a thread of unease climbing up into her belly. I don't trust the Cambion, Wendy said, orange lights flaring in his dome. She incapacitated the vampire seemingly on a whim, and is doing her best to distract you. I don't know, Hollie said, her mind telling her to relax. She's been really friendly, and you heard her story. She understands. That is the tea talking, Wendy replied. You're under the influence. We need to flee, either with or without the vampire before she comes back. Maz doesn't seem to be going anywhere, Hollie said, then giggled again before letting out a hiccup. Come on, Wendy, give the girl a chance. We've just been through so much. You're jumpy, and I get it, but she's cool. She's not cool. Hollie froze, her head turning in the bot's direction. I thought I heard. What did you say? You heard me. I said she's not cool. Dad? Hollie's mouth fell open. You're alive? I mean, you're back? Her entire body was tingling. She thought she'd lost her father again, this time forever, but now he was speaking from the bot again. Honey, I'm so pleased to be reunited as well, but right now you've got to listen to me. Something is wrong here. Wendy is 100% correct. You need to get out of here, and I mean now. Okay, Dad, she said, shaking her head. Maybe you're right. I do feel a little off now that you mention it. She reeled in the direction of the door, only to find it blocked. Her eyes found a familiar face, and Hollie let out a groan. Not you! Me! Dallin said, grinning at her. He wasn't alone, however. Beside him stood a gray-skinned creature with a black leather eye patch. Menace radiated from him. Scowling down at her, he filled Hollie with fright, and the fear cleared some of the cobwebs from her mind. The only thing she could think in the moment was that she'd once again been a fool. Looks like Maz was right. The imp would turn up again. Why did it have to be now? Chapter 15. Get away! Be gone from me, blasted kobolds! Hollie had managed to scare them off once before disappearing back into the shop, but the lizard men were back, poking and prodding and trying to pick his pockets. Maz was vibrating with anger, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't move even a single muscle. He's got to have something good, the leader said, fully shoving his head into Maz's long jacket. His kind usually carries around a pouch of coin, another said, shoving his scaly hands into Maz's boots. Maybe he's tucked it in here. Infernal kobolds! The moment I can move again, I'll hang you all upside down by your toes for the next century. We could take his fangs, the runt said, looking the vampire over appraisingly. It grabbed hold of his jacket and pulled itself up until he was plopped on Maz's shoulder. A green finger pulled his lips apart. I've heard that the wolf packs will always pay for leech fangs. Try it. Anger burned inside Maz, fierce and hot. So fierce, in fact, that he didn't notice at first the scorching heat that came from another source. When he realized he was being summoned, he wanted to groan. A moment later, he was no longer standing in the street. He was in the Prince of Darkness's formal audience chamber, the black and white patterned floor a dead giveaway. Maz lifted his head, then let out a shout of relief in his mind. Finally! I can move again! That relief was short-lived. I swear to all the gods in the multiverse, Maz, I can't take my eyes off of you for even 1 second. To say Samael was agitated would have been a colossal understatement. Guards in blood-red uniforms flanked him on all sides, standing at attention. The Angel of Death was pacing, his movements jerky. Why have you left the palace with the human female? You were just supposed to keep an eye on the human until which time I have need of her. So why are the pair of you prancing around Battlebond, tangling with demons? Maz couldn't exactly share the truth that Hollie had escaped and was looking for passage out of Pluto with his master, so he told him something that wasn't an outright falsehood. She was bored, and since no timeline was established, I figured some sightseeing would help pass the time. Samael stopped his pacing and looked at Maz with narrowed eyes, his expression full of skepticism. You expect me to believe? He paused, then held up a finger to the vampire. Holding out his other hand, palm toward the ceiling, he focused his attention as a small puff of smoke appeared to hover above his hand. The puff resolved itself into a figure in a miniature of a male with dark skin draped in burnt orange robes. His mostly bald head glinted in the light, his eyes rimmed with black. His carefully styled mustache seemed to twitch as the small image spoke. Samael leaned in to listen, and unfortunately the tiny man's words did not carry despite Maz's supernatural hearing. The vampire knew then that the creature was using magic, not only to broadcast his image from somewhere else, but to make sure that only Samael could hear his message. You're certain? The prince asked, not bothering to muffle his own speech. This isn't just some desert hallucination. He's a djinn. The thought came suddenly, but Maz was certain of his assessment. It would explain his strange appearance and magical abilities, as well as Samael's reference to the desert, since djinn were known to congregate in hot, dry areas. It didn't surprise him to know that the prince had dealings with djinn. On the contrary, his boss kept company with the worst sort, but djinn were more powerful than most, including Maz himself. Is that all? Samael asked, straightening when the little man nodded. Continue keeping tabs on Araman, then. And Raven, if I find that anything you've told me is not completely accurate, you'll find yourself bound to much worse than the likes of Saeed of Deep Sands. The image disappeared in another poof of smoke, and Samael turned his attention back to the vampire. Tell me about the bubble dimension. The change of topic threw Maz for a moment. Bubble dimension? You know the one, Samael said, motioning insistently. You ended up there somehow by mistake, poked around, made a mess, and left again. Tell me about your time there. That about sums it up, Maz admitted, trying to keep cagey. The bubble dimension, a pocket realm that had been smaller even than his own, was formed of strong magic that was almost impenetrable. They had recently discovered the bubble's owner, when Nevroel, Samael's own sister, had shown up to waylay and torture Hollie because of their intrusion. But Maz wasn't certain if Samael was privy to that last piece of information. Samael approached, a wild look in his eyes. While I have sometimes appreciated that you can be a man of few words, I'm going to need you to rely on your attention to detail and provide me with useful information." He lifted his finger, pointing it at Maz's head. "Or I can go into your mind and drag out the information I need myself, but I can promise you it will hurt." It was a small realm, like a large room. Well furnished, mirrored walls. I tried repeatedly to get us out by bursting through the walls, but they would repair themselves before I could get through. The magic protecting the realm was too powerful. Samael didn't consider this enough. "What else?" Maz spent the next few minutes explaining everything he could remember about the furnishings, the artwork, and dresser filled with tiny drawers containing random objects. He repeated everything he remembered, except for his knowledge of the bubble realm's owner. "We only escaped when a witch was able to crack the spell and pull us out. I have no idea where the realm is located in the web, nor how to get back there." "Perhaps if I restored your ability to travel," Samael said appraisingly, a finger to his chin, "you should be able to return to any place you've been." "Potentially," Maz agreed, not wanting to add that areas protected by magic would disallow that, such as Aramon's neutral zone in the other prince's realm. He knew Samael would know that as well. "He's toying with me again." "I think not," Samael said. "Your punishment stands." The Angel of Death stared at him, his expression intense, and Maz knew that he was waiting for the vampire to expose his secrets. Fortunately, he'd served Samael long enough to know how to avoid some of his traps. He remained quiet, his expression impassive. "I have reason to believe the realm you visited belongs to Nevroel," he said at last, "which makes finding it a priority. Unfortunately, you aren't as useful as you used to be, and I know that sending you off to locate it will do as much good as telling a demon to remain chaste. So I would encourage you to return to the keep with your human charge and stay put until I call for you again. Do you think you can manage that?" "I can," Maz said, resisting the urge to mouth off in response to Samael's smarmy tone. When he'd first been turned and subsequently tortured, Maz would never have dreamed to talk back to his master or ignore one of his orders. But he was no longer in Samael's thrall. Hollie had set him free. And for that, I can't thank her enough. "Dismissed," Samael said, his lip curling in disgust. He then turned to the uniformed man who had just entered the chamber. Forgetting that his abilities were curtailed, Maz attempted to teleport away. Disgruntled but disguising it, he turned on his heel and walked out of the audience chamber. As soon as the door closed behind him, he rushed at super speed out of the keep and into the ruins surrounding it. He wanted to reach his mate as quickly as possible, and since he could no longer be by her side in the blink of an eye, he'd have to use his other abilities to do so. He zipped, lunged, and sailed over debris and fallen structures, his mind feeling as chaotic as the destroyed section of the city. His realization in the audience chamber stuck with him, and he considered the way he'd been approaching his relationship with Hollie. He was rooted in his own perspective, thinking she was ignoring his suggestions and making trouble for them, but he'd been blind to his own imperiousness. As a powerful vampire, he was used to giving orders and having them followed, but matehood wasn't about control or expecting your partner to give in to your every demand. He was realizing that it was about compromise, understanding, putting the other person first and being willing to let go of the reins and let them lead, even if you weren't sure they knew what they were doing. "I am a fool." As he raced toward his mate, he made a decision. "I'm going to let her lead, whether I think she's uninformed or reckless. She's trusted me enough to follow my lead most of the time. I owe her the same respect. She saved me from a hollow existence, kowtowing to an overbearing monster. Instead of showing her gratitude, I've doubled down on bossiness. She isn't sure we have a future together, and I doubt it's just because of the danger Samael and his family represents. If I can't change, then she'll be right. We don't have a future together. I need to change." It wasn't going to be easy winning Hollie over. She had every right to be angry. None of this was her fault, and her association with him had definitely led to a bad situation. It's up to me to prove that it won't stay bad. I have to show her that the future we have together is bright. Easier said than done. Maz cleared the ruins and rushed into the city proper, dashing down streets and alleys until he arrived back in front of the shop he'd left not long ago. He stood there for a moment, focusing on his strategy. I will not punish the creature who hexed me with that stillness spell. I will ask Hollie what she needs and what she wants to do, and I will support whatever answer she gives. Maz didn't intend to become a pushover, but he did want to give her control over her destiny whenever possible. I've followed orders from Samael. Commands from Hollie have got to be more palatable. Plus, I have the added bonus of being around her, something I crave more than anything in the multiverse. His affection for Hollie was growing, and he knew it wasn't just based on the instinct of the mating bond. He enjoyed being around her, liked her quirky sense of humor, the way she talked and laughed easily. He respected her loyalty to her friends and her willingness to fight for what she thought was right. And he had never felt such a fierce physical attraction in his long life. She drove him mad with desire, something he had to keep under wraps to risk spooking her. Maz wanted to spend hours wrapped up in pleasure with his dream woman, and it was getting more difficult to stop himself from sweeping her into his arms and kissing her senseless.
"There he is again,"
his vampiric hearing told him the voice was coming from the alley beside the shop. A surreptitious glance in that direction revealed that it belonged to one of the kobolds. The three of them were peeking out of the end of the alley, discussing whether they could go back to digging through his pockets. Maybe I should take this opportunity to teach them a lesson. Maz figured Hollie was safe where she was for another few moments. He used his superior speed to move into the shadows, hoping it would look like he'd disappeared. The kobolds let out a few groans and tumbled out of the end of the alley, heading off down the street. Maz followed, sticking to the shadows so as not to reveal himself. They made it to the end of the block, then turned a corner. The vampire chose this moment to strike, rushing at them like a blur and grabbing the nearest kobold. Tucking the creature under his arm, he snatched the next one, then the next, until he had 3 wriggling lizard men in his grasp. He was so much faster than the creatures that their squirming didn't prevent him from reaching his goal. A moment later, he released them and watched them try to scatter. Try as they might, they couldn't. Maz had succeeded in tying their tails together. He knew it would be annoying to untangle them, but it would not cause permanent damage. And I have to admit, it's pretty funny to watch them scramble all over each other. Next time you see a vampire taking a moment of silent reflection, I suggest you leave him alone. He made his voice as gruff and commanding as possible. The 3 kobolds let out simultaneous shouts of fear and finally managed to work together enough to limp off down the street at top speed. Maz watched them go until they disappeared from sight around another corner, then let out a chuckle. It felt good to accomplish something, even if it was something as innocuous as punishing the people who'd tried to rob him. Now it's time to go for something even bigger, showing Hollie that I'm a man worthy of her love. Chapter 16. I'm in big trouble. The fog from the tea was beginning to clear, and Hollie realized she'd been duped. Dallin and his companion entered the shop and closed the door behind themselves. The look on the imp's face was impassive, but she could see the lines of stress around his eyes. It seemed Dallin wasn't too keen on his traveling companion. Hollie couldn't blame him. That guy is the epitome of ugly, and he terrifies me. She spent a moment wondering whether she could push past the pair blocking the door to reach Maz outside. But if the vampire was still incapacitated, there would be nothing he could do to help. And to be honest, the menace radiating off the demon creature was so powerful she wasn't sure she could make herself take the risk. Maybe this is an opportunity, she told herself, feeling sick to her stomach at the direction of her thoughts. Dallin could teleport me off Pluto, and that's my single goal currently. Hollie felt her insides contract at the temptation of leaving this world and the vampire behind. She was hit by a pang of longing that was so strong it surprised her. She forced herself to hang on to the anger she'd felt at his imperious behavior. He might believe we're soulmates, but I don't believe we'll ever work as a couple. Hollie knew it would be an uphill battle building a life with a vampire. Even if he could change his behavior, their pairing was extraordinary, even in this universe where almost anything seemed possible. If he can be trusted, and that's a big if, then the Cambion's own experience proves that our relationship has no legs. She wanted children, and if by some miracle she could have them with Maz, then their offspring would certainly experience some of what the Cambion had. Half-breeds weren't welcomed by either of their races, it seemed, which was just one more reason that being with a vampire long-term didn't make sense. "What do you want from me?" she asked the imp, taking a step backward. "You don't need me to trade to Aramon anymore. I don't even think Samael is looking for you right now. You were free, which was what you wanted. Why would you even come back to Pluto? It wasn't Dallin who answered her. The gray demon stared at her with his one bloodshot eye as if he were looking deep inside her. He stiffened, then let out a growl. She is the one I've been looking for. Hollie swallowed hard, not liking the sound of that. Who are you? She asked, gripping Wendy's hand and taking another couple steps backwards. This is the Eye, Dallin said, his gaze on the creature. There was something in his expression that made her realize that the imp was keeping a close watch, worried about what the demon would do. The Eye lunged at her, grabbing her by the arm. You will reveal the location of Nevrael immediately! At the mention of Nev's name, Hollie let out a groan. Addressing the imp, she didn't bother to hide her frustration. You know that I've got nothing to do with that woman! Dallin kept his eyes on the demon, and Hollie could see a trickle of fear flowing onto his face. The Eye shook his head once. You lie! I can see the truth of things! What do you mean? She attempted to pull away from him, but his grip was sure and tight. Your friend here has told me about what transpired on Nyx. I know that Nevrael was present, and that it was your presence that brought her there. Hollie shook her head. She wasn't there for me. She was there for an argument with her brothers. I don't know what the imp told you, but he's a known liar. There was a laugh from the back of the shop, and Hollie turned to see the Cambion standing behind the counter watching the exchange. She's got you there, Dallin. The human has your number. I know what the imp knows, the Eye growled angrily, pulling Hollie's attention back to him. And I also know that you are involved with Nevrael. I can see what is to come, and I know that you and she will cross paths again. When it happens, I intend to be there as well. Hollie shook her head, too frightened to believe his words. You can see the future. Is that what you're saying? He didn't bother to reply, and Hollie knew then that it must be true. Her head swung back in the direction of the counter, hoping that the Cambion had caught on to what was happening, and that her newfound friend would come to her aid by magical means. Please help me, Hollie called to her. I've had run-ins with the imp in the past. He's always planning something terrible, and I don't like the look of his new friend. Oh, I know all about Dallin, Malefia revealed. We go way back. Keep your mouth shut, Cambion, or the deal is off. Dallin's voice was rough, his tone saying he was worried about the woman disturbing the balance between him and the demon. Hollie shook her head. I should have known you were up to something. Maz is always warning me about trusting the wrong person. He acts like everyone is out to harm me, but I prefer to give people the benefit of the doubt, but folks like you ruin it. Malefia looked at her, not answering, but Hollie thought she caught a glimpse of regret on the Cambion's face. She turned back to the demon. I don't know what you think you've seen, but I can tell you now that I have no clue where that woman is, and I have no desire to ever see her again. The Eye's features stiffened. It doesn't matter what you desire, human. I know with a certainty that you will cross paths with Nevrael again. You will tell me how you came to know her, and will provide any clues to her whereabouts. I don't know what Dallin told you, but everything I'm about to say is the truth. Hollie wasn't eager to go over the whole sordid story yet again, but it was clear she wasn't going to be able to escape being caught up in Nev's mess. Through a magical accident, I was transported to what I've heard referred to as a pocket realm. It was like a kind of bubble, and we were only able to escape it with the help of a witch. I don't know how we got there or where the realm is. Nevrael discovered that we'd been there and came after me. Sure, I was involved in some plot with her brothers against her. And is there a plot? The demon asked. You must admit it does look that way. You're here now on Pluto, having somehow survived a run-in with the 3 very powerful beings on Nyx. That would make it look like you were working with Samael all along. I don't care what it looks like. The only reason I'm here is because Samael insisted after the fact. I'd never been to Pluto before, and frankly, I'm looking for a way out of the realm right now. The Eye looked at her appraisingly. Nothing you've said has changed my vision of the future. You will see Nevrael again, in a room of mirrors. Mirrors? Hollie murmured, thinking immediately of the bubble realm. She was about to mention something to that effect when Malefia interrupted. Well, it looks like my part in this process is finished. She came around the counter and joined their loose grouping. Now it's time for you to hold up your end of the bargain, imp. What exactly is this bargain? Hollie asked, still stung that the Cambion would turn on her. Although she barely knew her, She'd liked the woman's brass personality and had hoped to have a new friend in the making. Chalk one up to me being a poor judge of character, I guess. As I said, the imp and I go way back, Malefia explained. Dallin routinely loses to me at cards. Only because you cheat, the imp replied in a huff. That's a rude accusation, the Cambion responded, then laughed. And one you can't prove. You're lucky I can't, and half the demons that you've fleeced over the years would rush here to rip those deformed half-breed wings off your back. Malefia kept smiling through the imp's comments, and Hollie admired her for that. Dallin's comment confirmed to her that not everything the woman had said was a lie. Hybrids formed from a relationship between two different races were treated with disregard. Maybe if you weren't so obsessed with a certain vampire lieutenant always chasing after you, you would have played better, the Cambion said lightly. So imagine my surprise when I came across said vampire with a little human companion, one that matched the description of a female you'd been looking for as well. It took you long enough, Dallin grumbled. I put out word about the human weeks ago, after she'd given me the slip on Araman. Matter of fact, I had already found her again myself by then. Malefia shrugged. Looks like she gave you the slip then, since you seemed real happy to hear she was in my shop when I sent you that message a moment ago. Dallin didn't answer, just stared at the Cambion, a look of annoyance broadcasting on his features. It would appear I finally have something special enough to get me a ticket off-world permanently. I don't suppose we could add in a free companion fare, Hollie suggested, eyeing the imp. 2 for the price of 1? Malefia laughed. I like her. She's got spirit. Tell me about it, Dallin grumbled, rolling his eyes. Hollie turned to the Cambion, remembering what she'd said in their conversation earlier. I'm confused, though. You said you came here looking to reunite with your father. I did, Malefia admitted. But what I didn't tell you was the rest of the story. My father was an incubus, one who isn't allowed to father children outside the demonic line. My existence is a threat to him, which is what he told me when I confronted him last. He told me he'd be forced to deal harshly with me if the truth ever became known. Hollie was surprised that she could still feel bad for the Cambion who had used her as a bargaining chip, but she did. That sort of rejection, especially from one's own father, had to have been crushing. Pluto sucks, Hollie said when she could think of nothing else to say. What say we get out of here while the getting is good? 3 faces stared at her with varying looks of incredulity at her brazen suggestion. Malefia started laughing. No matter what wonders I see in the web, humans remain the ones most able to surprise me. Hollie smiled and nodded along, praying that they gave in to her proposal. If this works and I get off-world, no one will be more surprised than me. The image of Maz entered her mind, and she was hit with a wave of bad feelings. She didn't want to leave the vampire behind, but she knew he'd attack the imp on sight. Telling herself that she had no better options, she leaned into leaving him behind, even as it tore her up inside. Chapter 17. Enough! The Eye barked. Stop your bickering and bartering. I want information and I want it now! Hollie opened her mouth to tell him once again that she did not have the information that he wanted, but before she could speak, the door behind them burst open. Maz flew through it, wasting no time grabbing the imp in a headlock. His expression was murderous, and Hollie knew it was only a matter of time before he tore Dallin's head clean off. She was about to scream at him to stop, knowing that they needed the imp to leave Pluto, since Maz's own powers to teleport were disabled, but she didn't get a chance to. The Eye raised his arm, the palm of his hand outward toward Maz. A beam of green light shot from it, hitting the vampire so hard that he flew across the store, knocking over several shelves on the way. Malefia wasted no time grabbing the now freed Dallin's arm and pulling him back to his feet. Get me out of here, she said, holding her wand to Dallin's head. Right now, or I make it so you're stuck in your imp form forever. Folks mock me for my deformed wings, so let's see what they say when they get a look at your true form. The threat must have worked, because a moment later the imp vanished with the Cambion in tow. Maz let out a howl of anger, having picked himself up from the debris of smashed wood and glass jars. Whoever you are, demon, you have angered the wrong vampire. Hollie's eyes shot to the Eye, who did not seem perturbed either by Maz's warning or the vanishing of his 2 partners in crime. He released his hold on her and clamped his hands together once. The sound seemed to echo out in a wave, heading straight for the vampire. When the wave hit, it pushed Maz back. He hit the wall behind him, buffeted again and again as the sound rocked him over and over, like waves against the side of a boat. He struggled against it, attempting to push back, to propel himself forward, but the waves of sound kept him restrained. "We don't have to do this," Hollie said gently, hoping to de-escalate the situation. "I have been completely open and honest with you. We can both go our separate ways without making things worse than they already are." The eye turned in her direction, his face impassive. He turned his back on Maz, and Hollie saw that the spell had finished. Maz shoved off the wall and in the demon's direction, and before Hollie could calm him down, he attacked, slamming into the eye. Hollie grabbed Wendy around the middle and pulled the bop back in the direction of the counter. She knew things were about to get crazy, and the last thing she needed was to be injured by a stray blow. Behind the counter, she crouched low and insisted that the bot do the same. "Guys!" she shouted as the two traded blows. "Violence doesn't solve anything, or hadn't you heard?" "Violence solves some things," Maz grunted from his position atop the eye, who lay beneath him, temporarily stunned by a flurry of powerful punches to his midsection. Suddenly, the vampire was blasted upward by a flash of green light. He bounced off the ceiling and fell back to the ground, able to tumble in a way that had him back on his feet in moments. The eye was also standing, and he held up a finger to the vampire. "You cannot defeat me, leech. It would be better if you returned to licking your master's boots for whatever hours remain before the apocalypse wipes out your kind of filth." "I'll never leave her," Maz growled and threw himself back into the fray. For a moment it looked as if he might get the upper hand on the demon, but the eye seemed to avoid every blow now, moving his body out of the way a split second before Maz landed a punch. Over and over the vampire attacked, and every time the demon avoided the blow. He can see the future. Hollie realized the eye was using his ability to guess where Maz would try and hit him next. In that moment, she knew that Maz couldn't best the creature, but that didn't stop the vampire from continuing to try. He reeled when the eye shot lightning in his direction, barely getting out of the way before being pumped with electricity. The vampire leapt onto the top of a nearby shelf, kicking jaws out of the way as he ran along it and hopped to the next. He swung a kick at the eye's head, but the creature ducked, then grabbed his leg and swung him to the ground, slamming him into the floor with outrageous force. She could tell that it hurt. Maz's face was screwed up in a grimace of pain, but even that wouldn't deter him from keeping up the fight. "Stop!" Hollie cried, fearful that the vampire would never stop, that he'd let himself be beat to death trying to protect her. It was Nyx all over again, and she couldn't go through that again. Picking up one of the tea tins, she chucked it at the back of the demon's head. She followed up with another one, this tin glancing off the eye's ear, but it did nothing to stop him from using his magic against Maz. The demon flicked a finger toward the shelf beside him, and suddenly jaws started flying off in Maz's direction, smacking him with shattering glass over and over again. Her fear was rising, and Hollie was afraid that if something didn't give soon, Maz might find himself down for the count. She'd seen him face off against incredible odds before, though, and she didn't want to give up on him. But things were beginning to look bleak. Wendy must have sensed the direction of her thoughts because he tugged on her dress to get her attention.
"Giving in to the eye's demands may be the best way forward," he told her quietly.
"I'm not sure how to do that," Hollie admitted, speaking in a whisper. "I don't know where Nev or her damn bubble realm are."
"I've been thinking about that. I could have a way of helping to pinpoint the location of the pocket realm everyone has been talking about."
The cascade of green lights in his dome let her know that Wendy was serious. Hollie bit her lips, her eyes returning to the battle. Maz was wounded, and despite his super-fast healing abilities, he looked worn out. She wasn't sure how much longer the vampire would be able to continue the fight. The eye, on the other hand, wasn't even winded. He looked vaguely bored, like keeping the vampire back wasn't expending an ounce of effort. "Are we sure that giving this guy what he wants is the right choice?" Hollie had thought coming to Pluto was the correct decision, but she'd quickly learned that she'd screwed up again. The last thing she wanted was to cause even more grief for herself and for Maz. "I'm not sure we've got time to debate the pros and cons." This came from the voice of her father. "It doesn't look like the vampire is long for this world if things continue as they are, And while it might solve some problems to have Maz dead, I think that you might have taken a shine to the guy. Maybe you wouldn't want that to happen."
"Of course not, Dad. I don't want Maz to die."
Hollie bit her lip, afraid to screw up again, but equally terrified of doing nothing and letting the eye kill Maz in the process. Taking a deep breath, she at last made a decision. "Stop!" she called out. "I'll do what you want, give you the information that you want, but you have to vow not to hurt the vampire." "Not again!" Maz groaned as he picked himself up off the floor once again. "Could we maybe not stop making new vows and bargaining for my life?" Despite being surprised by the vampire's uncharacteristically deliberative tone, Hollie ignored him, even though it pained her to do so. "I can tell you the location of the bubble realm, but you have to take us somewhere safe first. I will only give you this information if you take us away from Pluto and you stop trying to stomp the vamp to death." The eye considered her offer. Maz, however, wasn't ready to give up his hope of defeating their adversary. He launched himself at the eye again, but the demon easily held him off with a flick of the wrist. Maz scratched and clawed and beat against the block, but he couldn't reach his target. Maz focused his ice-blue gaze on her. She was expecting his anger, but his tone was once again calm. "Are you certain this isn't madness, Hollie? You could be trading in one destructive force for another, not to mention the vow. If you leave Pluto, Samael will know, and the vow you made will be broken. Who knows what the consequences of that will be?" "Exactly," she countered. "Who knows what will happen, but here, I know exactly what will happen. You'll never give up on trying to protect me, which means you'll force this demon, this more powerful demon, I might add, to kill you. In my opinion, getting off Pluto intact makes the most sense, and we can deal with the fallout later." "I agree," the eye said then. "I will accept your terms, and you will provide the location. But let me warn you, if you attempt to lie to me or evade me, you will reap the whirlwind. I will not be put off, charmed, or tricked." Hollie breathed heavily. She knew Wendy had an idea to determine the location of the bubble realm, but that didn't mean it would work. She trusted the bard implicitly, and he'd never let her down yet, but that didn't mean he was infallible. Giving the demon a nod, she let out a breath. "Agreed." Her eyes flicked to Maz, expecting the vampire to groan or bark orders or fight harder against the shield, but instead he seemed to accept her decision. He stopped struggling against the block and stood quietly. She was thrown sideways by his behavior, but told herself it didn't matter in the moment. All that matters now is finding out where this damn bubble realm is so that people will finally leave us alone. "There is a safe location I can take you where we can discuss things," the eye offered, moving in her direction and holding out his hand. "I've been tricked too many times by demons offering to transport me somewhere safe," Hollie replied. "So you'll excuse me if I decline to allow you to choose our destination." "What did you have in mind?" the eye asked in response. "I want you to transport me, Wendy, and Maz to the Fae realm." It was the place where she had the most allies, and with the help of the Fae royal family, she might be able to deal with the demon and his demands with their help. An eerie smile crossed the demon's face, and she was shocked when he nodded in agreement. "The Fae realm it should be!" Hollie gestured toward Maz, who walked forward to grip the eye's shoulder. Securing an arm around the bot's waist, Hollie reached out to take the demon's hand. With a fantastic whoosh, they left Samael's gloomy realm behind in the blink of an eye. Chapter 18. When Hollie could open her eyes again, she blinked in confusion. They'd found themselves in a dreary stone chamber that looked nothing like the shining, spotlessly clean spaces she was used to seeing in the Fae realm. "He tricked me. I can't believe I fell for it again." "You've cheated," Hollie accused the demon, ripping her hand out of his. "This isn't the Fae realm. Where have you taken us?"
"My location systems are saying that we are, in fact, in the realm of the Fae," Wendy piped up. Still, Hollie wasn't convinced. She opened her mouth to speak again, but Maz beat her to the punch. He moved forward to put a loose arm around her shoulder. "Answer the woman's question," he growled at the demon. Hollie looked up at him, still surprised at his change in demeanor. Before she left him frozen in the middle of the street, he'd been issuing orders as usual. Now he seemed to be content to back up her decisions. She wondered what had prompted this change in perspective from the vampire. The eye ignored the demand. He moved to the fireplace and bent down to ignite a fire with a snap of his fingers. Standing, he moved to a bank of cabinets and opened one, digging inside it. It was clear to Hollie that he was familiar with the space. "You will respond," Maz said more forcefully, "or you cannot expect Hollie to honor her part of the deal." "She will honor it," the eye said, turning around with writing charcoal and a piece of parchment. "I have brought you to the place you requested, the Fae realm."
"I can confirm that location,"
Wendy piped up in agreement. "Explain yourself," the vampire demanded. "These are my chambers, although I must admit I haven't been here in a while, so pardon my dust." He moved to a table and took a seat, gesturing toward the other chairs. Hollie shrugged, then walked forward, bringing the bot with her. Maz moved to pull out a chair across from the eye for her. He settled into the seat next to her while Hollie placed the bot on the table. "How did a demon earn a place in the Fae realm?" she asked him, confused. "I lived in this realm many years, and I am generally well regarded, although it may take a little work for me to get back in the royal family's good graces after our little misunderstanding on Ahriman-Abad." Ahriman-Abad? Her thoughts jostled against each other until a memory rose to the top. "Wait, I remember that. You're the demon that took the strike force to Ahriman-Abad that attempted to rescue Gilly. But you dumped them off in the Prince's Keep, which was supposed to be impossible, and the attempt failed." The eye gave a sheepish grin. "I admit it wasn't my finest moment, but I had to get Ahriman's attention somehow." "How did you pull it off?" Maz asked, resting his chin on his fist. "My abilities to travel would not allow me past Ahriman's prohibitive spells." "I'll keep my secrets," the eye replied stiffly. "And if you remember, I'm the one with the questions to ask. We are in the Fae realm, as you requested, and as confirmed by your little tin man. Now it is time for you to hold up your end of the bargain." Hollie had no choice but to believe Wendy's assessment on their location. It was time to trust the bot again, to see if he really could locate Nev's pocket dimension. "Well, Wendy, are you ready to work your techno-magic? Can you pinpoint the bubble's location?" Wendy let out a high-pitched whistle.
"I believe I can, but it will require a sample for analysis."
"A sample?" She felt the vampire stiffen beside her. "There is no way you're going to start poking and prodding and cutting Hollie open." Before he could continue, Wendy's little white hand stretched out to pluck a single hair from Hollie's head.
"This should be sufficient," he stated. "Trace particulates from every realm a person has visited should be present in their hair."
The robot popped open a little door in his torso and placed the strand of hair inside. He closed the door and started to emit a series of beeps. Hollie was amazed that he might be able to tell something like that from a single hair, but then she remembered how Nevroel had found her on Belafonte. The dark lady had held up a strand of Hollie's hair as proof that she'd been involved in invading her secret realm. The eye watched the robot, his attention fully on the analysis. Hollie, however, was filled with nervous energy. What if this doesn't work? What if we just end up enraging the demon? He's powerful enough to defeat Maz and do whatever he wants with me as well. The vampire seemed to sense the direction of her thoughts and gently ran his hand over her back, intent on comforting her. She realized that he was monitoring her emotions with the help of her own blood. It was an uncomfortable realization, and she stood, moving to pace the chamber. Maz watched her for a moment, then rose to stand by her side. "I know what you are thinking," he murmured, then closed his eyes and sighed at her distressful look. "I don't mean literally. What I meant was, yes, I can sense your emotions, but that isn't automatically a bad thing. It means we are more in tune. I know you are anxious. I know you are tired. I know you need someone to lean on. I'm volunteering my services." She gave the vampire an appraising look. "What was the deal back in Malefia's shop? I kept expecting you to bark out orders. Instead, it was almost like you were validating my choices. I must have been hallucinating that." Maz grinned, and it transformed his face, reminding her that he was really a beautiful man. It felt good to see him smile again, even if they weren't in the best of circumstances.
I realize that I've been trying to take charge, but you're the one who should be in control. I now know that I need to learn how to stand back and be supportive, not just bark orders, as you said." "Wow," she breathed, surprised at his response. Then she narrowed her eyes. "Is this just you telling me what you think I want to hear? Because manipulation means you're still trying to control me." Maz put a hand over his heart and solemnly shook his head. "My intentions are genuine. I only want to prove to you that we do have a future together." Hollie's spirits fell. She wanted to trust him badly, but it was hard because she felt like she was always at a disadvantage with the vampire. Not only was he capable of all these fantastical things, but he could now almost read her mind. It seemed like the deck was stacked against her, and it was hard to trust someone in that situation. Again, he sensed her shift of emotions and took her hand. "I wish you would share in this blood bond," he said softly after checking to make certain the eye was still monitoring the bot. "You would have no reason to doubt me if you could sense how I feel about you." She stared at him, unsure of how to reply. It was tempting, the ability to peer into the vampire's heart, to be certain that he was telling her the truth, and that he only wanted to support and protect her. But the idea of willingly swallowing some of the vampire's blood was frightening. Besides, he hasn't been exactly forthcoming about the process. He hid the fact that he could sense my emotions and know when I'm thinking about him. Who knows what else he might be hiding? What if drinking from him has a downside? Or worse, what if it transforms me into a vampire as well? Right now, she wasn't sure she could afford the risk of something else going wrong. She was about to tell him so, but Wendy let out a high whistle, attracting everyone's attention.
"I have completed my analysis," the bot said, "and will now disseminate my results."
Hollie returned to the table to sit by the bot, holding her breath. Maz was at her side a second later, a hand resting on her shoulder. The eye picked up his chalk and held it over the parchment, his expression eager. A beam of light emanated from the bot, and Hollie realized he was projecting something on the wall across from them. They appeared to be a series of circles connected by white lines in what looked like a random array. Hollie was suddenly reminded of the infinite project Gresh had built back on the bot's home realm. Suddenly the image shifted, and it looked as if they were traveling among the points, the circles spinning and revolving, growing larger and brighter until it suddenly stopped. One light kept blinking, and a series of letters and numbers appeared on the screen, making absolutely no sense to Hollie.
"This seems to be the location of the realm in question. The hair sample provided a list of all realms that Hollie has visited, and I have accounted for the ones I already know about, including the Fae realm, Valencia, La Bellafont, Aramon, and Pluto. There were some others you hadn't mentioned, but those are known realms with large populations. This is the only one that seems to fit the descriptions you've given."
The eye's remaining eye lit up, and his hand began scribbling on the parchment. "This is the answer I've been waiting for," he said, and Hollie could hear the excitement in his voice. "Finally, I will be able to—" The rest of his words were lost when the door to his chamber suddenly flew open, and without warning, all hells broke loose around them. Chapter 19. At the threshold stood a cluster of Fae in identical black uniforms. Hollie's eyes widened when she realized they were members of the Kingsblade, the crack squad made up of the most powerful magic users in the Fae realm. She'd encountered a few during her time there, and on a whole, they'd made her feel nervous. A tall, red-haired female was at the forefront, and as soon as her gaze landed on Maz, she lifted her hand and flung a spell in the vampire's direction. Maz dodged quickly out of the way, but all the while the eye kept up his scribbling, ignoring the chaos taking place around him. Hollie stood, grabbing Wendy and dropping to her knees to crawl under the table. Maz, meanwhile, was confronting the threat head-on. The vampire lunged toward the door, letting out a roar that rang out around the stone chamber. Gripping Wendy tightly, she peered out from beneath the table in time to see the pair of legs belonging to the eye suddenly vanish. That dirty demon! It seemed their escort had split now that he'd gotten the information he wanted. A moment later, Maz was flying through the air, slamming into a wall before landing on his feet and charging forward again. By this time, a dozen bodies had filled the room and were advancing in tandem. She saw a glow appear around them, and Hollie knew from her time among the Fae and the witches that this meant that they had linked their abilities together, making them exponentially stronger than before. Hollie knew the vampire was at a disadvantage because he was no longer able to teleport. Fae magic was powerful, and while he'd been able to appear and disappear at will, he still had an edge, but now he could only rely on his strength, speed, and experience against beings of superior magical abilities. Maz held his own for a while, managing to dodge and duck their magical attacks thanks to his speed, but he wasn't able to get close enough to physically harm any of the Kingsblade. The red-headed Fae kept her team focused on the vampire, flinging attack after attack, some of which finally managed to connect and bring Maz down. He wouldn't stay down for long, but Hollie knew he must be tired, given that he'd just done battle with the Eye as well. She worried that before long he'd be weak enough for the invaders to capture him. Releasing her hold on the bot, Hollie timed it so that she could crawl out from under the table without getting hit by a stray spell. Raising her hands, she tried to attract the redhead's attention. "Stop! We were invited here! We're guests of the royal family!" The woman ignored her cries, instead gesturing distractedly in her direction. Hollie felt herself being wrapped up in air and floated back to a position behind the advancing forces. It was obvious to her then that she was not a target. All their efforts were focused on the vampire. She bit her lip, trying to figure out what to do. Stepping carefully around the fray, she returned to the table where Wendy still held his position underneath. Her fear was laced with frustration at their situation. Maz finally decided he was going to follow my lead, and this is where I've led us. He supported my decision to come to the Fae realm, even though he must have realized that he could be in danger here. I didn't even think it through, it seems. I just knew my friends would have my back. I considered it a safe space, but I realize now that's only for me, not him. I've been a fool. I'm the idiot most other races say we humans are. And now Maz is paying the price. She watched as the image of a giant hand appeared, coming down to smack Maz to the ground. He lay there and groaned, this time taking longer to pull himself back to his feet. The King's blade advanced again, and Hollie knew that it wouldn't take long to surround the vampire. What they would do then, she wasn't sure. Capture him? Or kill him? She had to do something, and quickly, but she wasn't sure what. Hollie knew she was no match for the Fae, and besides, she wasn't the one they were after. I've got to find a way to divert their attention somehow. But even if she could, Hollie wasn't sure what she could do. There was no way to hide him or sneak him past the guards through the only exit. She had to assume they would capture him. The thought of being separated from Maz again was too much to bear in this moment of emotional weakness. I can't lose him. Not now. I owe him better than that. A plan started to form, one that she would have thought was insane only moments ago. Turning to the bot, she posed a question. Do you think you could create a diversion that would distract these Fae long enough for me to get to Maz? Dark purple lights flashed in Wendy's dome, letting her know he was concerned, but it was her father's voice that answered her. What are you planning, sweetheart? You're not going to throw yourself recklessly into danger, are you? No, Dad, she said, even though the truth was the opposite. But we've got to help him, or these Kingsblade could kill him in the name of protecting the realm. How can we help him? This came from Wendy. The bot sounded skeptical, which made Hollie all the more frantic. I have a plan, but I need to be able to reach him, and that one, she said, pointing out the lead redhead, isn't going to let me, so we need something that will distract her and the others while I go to him. There was a bright flash of light that made Hollie blink, then the sound of an impact. She looked in Maz's direction and found him lying on the floor, eyes closed, a trickle of blood coming from his mouth. Please, Wendy, I need your help, Hollie begged the bot, unable to take her eyes off the vampire, who was still unmoving. Suddenly, a loud sound like a trumpet playing underwater rocked the room, and it took Hollie a moment to realize it was coming from the bot. He was lit up again, projecting an image from his body, but since he was under the table, it was unlikely any of the Kingsblade could tell what was happening. In front of the door where the Fae had entered appeared a tall, many-armed beast of some sort. It shook its arms and stomped its large flat feet, then bellowed again, that same waterlogged trumpet sound. Focus on the beast! The leader yelled, and the squad pivoted, turning their backs on Maz for a moment. Hollie rushed out of a hiding place and to the vampire's side. Taking his hand gently, she softly touched his face. His eyes fluttered open, but only for a moment before they closed in pain again. Hollie took a deep breath, debating whether her plan was actually a good one. Her biggest fear at the moment, besides the vampire's death, was that they might somehow be separated again. Although she knew she'd have the support of Lena and Gilly, she wasn't so sure how the Fae Queen would feel about her bringing a vampire into the realm and setting him loose. Even if the Fae Queen and King granted their permission for Maz to stay in the realm, a lot could happen between now and the time that such a decision was made. Dallin or the Eye could appear and whisk Maz away. Or worse, Samael could come looking for him. If I want to be certain that I will know where Maz is, then I need to do this. A million doubts assailed her, but one rose to the fore. The one she'd been ignoring as best she could, but was really at the crux of everything she'd been doing since she left Earth. If I do this and it turns out everything Maz has said is true, I'm not sure how I'm going to accept that. It would mean, once and for all, that matehood existed and that she and the vampire were destined for one another. It was a hard pill to swallow, but in the moment, Hollie knew there was only one decision she could make. She would do anything to make sure Maz was safe, even drink blood. Wasting no more time, Hollie lifted his limp arm to her mouth. She hesitated for a second, overwhelmed with the momentous choice she was making. Then she bit down with all her might. A second later, a trickle of blood broke through the surface of his skin and touched her tongue. She closed her eyes, wondering if she'd made the right decision. What have I done, and what will it do to me? A rush of heat went through her, and she let his arm drop, overwhelmed by the riot of sensation. Then it hit her, the pain that he was feeling, and Hollie let out a groan. Toppling over, she writhed on the floor, eyes wide, her consciousness consumed by the vampire's own feelings. He was telling the truth, she realized just before the agony overwhelmed her. Chapter 20. He felt the pressure at his wrist, but just barely, so much did his body ache from the blows tossed at him by the Fae fighting force. Maz cracked his eyes open again, fighting against the urge to lose consciousness, to let himself rest for the first time in ages. What he saw shocked him. Hollie was lying on the floor beside him, blood staining her perfect lips. The bond between them was humming, and at first he assumed she was hurt because all he could feel between them was pain. Rage filled him, giving him the strength to lift himself to a sitting position and take her hand into his. There was a strange sound, some sort of roar that pulled his gaze in the direction of the Fae. Their backs were to him, their focus entirely on the creatures stomping around in front of them. Magic whirled and whizzed around the beast that seemed to have 6 arms, but none of the spells were able to land. "What in the hell's is going on here?" he croaked to himself. "Ouch!" He turned back to Hollie at the sound of her cry of pain, and he lifted her gently into his arms. "Who hurt you?" "You did," she grumbled, then leaned her head against his shoulder. "What do you mean?" he asked, aghast. "Is there any way I might have hurt her?" Shame radiated through him, shame and guilt. "Oh, it wasn't your fault, so stop feeling like that," she said a moment later, rubbing her temples. "I just meant you're hurt, so now I feel hurt too." Maz shook his head in confusion, then looked to her bloody lips again. He lifted his wrist to see a quickly healing puncture wound, and his mind managed to do the math. "You bit me!" She looked at him. "Duh, I thought you would feel it when I did it, like, through the bond." Maz looked inside himself and realized she was right. The pain radiating from her was actually feedback from his own wounds. A sudden elation burst into life inside him. He pulled her in tightly and kissed her, his passion overflowing. "I can't believe you drank from me," he whispered, then grinned when she shivered. "Okay, calm down, Casanova. They're falling for Wendy's little diversion now, but it's not going to take much longer for them to figure out it's just a hologram." Putting a hand on his chest, Hollie started to extract herself from his embrace, pulling herself to her feet. Maz followed, then quickly moved to place himself between her and the Fae. Their leader had noticed that Maz was back on his feet, and she'd lifted her hand, which crackled with energy. He flexed his muscles, ready to serve as a shield for the woman who had trusted him enough to complete their bond. Nothing could feel as amazing as this. "What in the 17 hells?" This came from the open door, and all heads turned to see who had spoken, including Maz's. Phaedra was standing there, her wings flapping in agitation. She entered the room, frowning, then walked directly through the projection of the horrible six-armed beast. "Were you guys actually fooled by this?" He felt Hollie's hand slip down his arm, and he turned just in time to catch her as she stumbled against him. "Boy, your blood is powerful stuff," she said, then giggled. "It's like being drunk on champagne, which I only was once before at a wedding. I had the dickens of a hangover the next day," she said, putting an arm around his neck. "Dad made me breakfast in bed that included the hair of the dog that bit me." "A dog bit you?" he asked, confused. "It's an expression," Frank replied as Wendy rolled out from under the table, now that the spell-slinging seemed to have paused. "It means I gave her a little champagne and some orange juice to help with her headache." Phaedra was looking around with a wrathful expression, hands on her hips. "Are you leafing kidding me?" she growled when she caught sight of the vampire. "I should have known it was you causing all this trouble." Lena pushed her way past Phaedra's wing, making way for herself and her sister, both twins followed by their respective mates. The leader of the King's Blade moved to meet them, bobbing her head respectfully. "We have apprehended the leech as instructed." "Thank you, Torva," Lena said graciously, although Hollie thought she caught an edge in her voice. "The King's Blade can stand down now. We will handle things from here." "With all due respect, I request that we be allowed to finish the job. The leech is dangerous, and it is paramount that we rid the realm of his sort of filth." "Noted," Gilly said, while Lena just stared at Torva with a stony expression. It was clear there was no love lost between those two, Hollie realized. "There is no need for you to finish the job," the royal twin continued. "My sister and I can handle things from here." "Don't forget about me," Phaedra said, her angry gaze fastened on the vampire. "Handling leeches is my favorite pastime." "This is the leech that we've been hunting for weeks," Torva pointed out, bristling. "And you're going to swoop in now that we've caught him?" "Do you want me to reprimand you for endangering a guest of the royal family in front of your troops?" Lena growled, unleashing her temper. "What about failing to report the incursion when you know the standing order is to alert my sister and me at any sighting of the vampire in question? I could have you whipped in the public square for that." Torva's face was like marble, but she bobbed her head once more, then gestured to the King's Blade to follow her from the room. When the door closed behind them, Gilly let out a whoop. "Damn, sister, you really let her have it. Would you really have whipped her in public? With that one? I would consider it. You have no idea what she put me through. She lives up to her name. Torva the Heartless." Lena sniffed, her face a mask that didn't relax until her husband Bracken put his arm around her. "What are you doing in the Eye's old quarters?" the royal twin asked next, her eyes scanning the room and noting the cobwebs and dust. Maz looked to Hollie to allow her to explain to her friends, but his mate remained slightly dazed from her tasting him. Phaedra moved closer, her face suspicious, and when she caught the remains of blood on Hollie's lips, she flipped. "What's going on here?" she snarled, leaping to pull Hollie out of his arms. Fiery eyes burned into Maz. "What did you do to her, to leave her bloody and dazed like this? I know the King's Blade would never lay a finger on her, or they'd be punished so severely their future offspring would feel it for 10 generations. "It was not me," Maz replied, doing all he could to hold his temper. He could feel Ollie's reaction to the question through the bond, and it made him a little nervous. There were notes of guilt and embarrassment mixed in with a dash of resentment and a splash of joy at being reunited with her friend. "It's okay," Hollie said, attempting to balance on her own again. "He didn't do anything to me, I promise you." "What's wrong with you?" Phaedra hissed into Hollie's ear. "It's clear that something is going on here. Are you drunk?" "It sort of feels that way," Hollie said with a wide grin, winking at Maz. His insides lit up at the small gesture, and he answered her with a grin of his own. He liked what he felt from the bond then, playfulness with a dash of desire. The Fae twins gathered around, Gilly putting a finger under her chin to pull her gaze to her. "Hollie, have you taken something? Are you under the effects of a magic spell of some sort?" "I guess you could say that," Hollie admitted. "It's the mating bond, which is sort of like magic, I suppose." "The mating bond?" Phaedra's expression was skeptical, and she bent back to shooting daggers from her eyes at the vampire. "Are you buying what he's feeding you now?" "I've felt it myself," she admitted, then giggled.
and it's so much more delightful than I could have possibly imagined. What's going on here? Lena asked Maz, aiming for a polite but forceful tone. Of the Fae who harried him regarding Hollie, she often felt like the one who cut him the most slack. But it was evident that answers were needed. Still, he didn't want to tell them what had happened until he knew Hollie was comfortable with it. The embarrassment he'd felt a moment before had vanished, but he knew it would be a mistake to speak for his mate, especially to these women. "Shh, it's okay," Hollie said, stumbling to her friend Lena and giving her a sloppy hug. "In fact, it's better than okay, now that he's not hurting anyone. For a second there, when I could feel how badly your magicians had beat him up, I almost couldn't stand it." Phaedra took her and shook her gently. "Hollie, you're scaring us. You need to explain what you're experiencing." She shot a murderous glance in Maz's direction, and he knew that when the truth was revealed, he was going to have one angry Fae on his hands. Maybe more than one. "I bit him," Hollie blurted out, then giggled again. "It was only a tiny bite, but it was enough to seal the bond, I guess, because I can feel everything he's feeling." She turned to look at him. "Happiness, pride, amazement, reverence." Hollie let out a sigh, her cheeks pink. "It's amazing." "You bit him!" The shock on Phaedra's face was mirrored by the rest of the folks in the room. The Fae warrior woman started looking Hollie over, turning her this way and that as if she could somehow find evidence of the bite through her inspection. "I can't believe you drank poisoned blood. You have no idea what the effects might be." "I agree," Gilly said, shooting Maz a look of regret. "We'd best get you looked over to make sure you're not suffering any ill effects." "Ladies, I'm fine," Hollie said, putting her arm around both Gilly's and Lena's shoulders. "I'm better than fine. I feel like I could run a 5-minute mile right now, and I hate running." "Glad to hear it," Lena said, leading Hollie to the door. "Let's go talk to my mother and tell her all about it." Gilly looked back over her shoulder, addressing the men. "You two stay here and make sure the vampire stays put." They exited the room, the little bot rolling after them. Phaedra stared Maz down. "I'll stick around too, in case he tries to teleport out of here. I've got a little trick I've been working on." "Too bad you won't get to use it," Maz said, going out on a limb. You could tell through Hollie's own words and by the feelings passing through the bond that Hollie trusted her friends unreservedly. He knew it was a risk, but he wanted to take a chance with trust as well. "Samael made me incapable of traveling as a punishment." Phaedra's jaw dropped, eyes narrowed. She shook her head. "I'm not going to stand around for any more of your lies." Nodding to the two remaining males, she said, "He's all yours. If he tries to do anything, you know what to do. I'm going to make sure Hollie doesn't need me." She walked out the door, slamming it behind her. "Is what you told her true?" Bracken asked after a moment. "You cannot teleport any more?" Maz nodded, and the copper-skinned Dev laughed. "That's quite a sacrifice for a human female." "It's worth it," the vampire replied without hesitation. "Love is powerful, is it not?" Solomon replied, then slapped Bracken on the back. The dark-haired Fae gave him a look, but didn't disagree. "And if you love a powerful woman," the Dev continued, shaking his head with a wide grin, "then you're in for even more of a ride. Hollie may not be physically powerful, but she's got tenacity. Having survived all that has happened to her in her fragile human form with no supernatural abilities or magic, it's pretty incredible." "She mentioned feeling what you feel," Bracken said, his brow furrowed. "Is that true? Can she sense your emotions?" "She can, and more than that. She knows where I am at all times, and she can tell if I am thinking about her, all through the matehood blood bond." Solomon let out a low whistle, and Bracken shook his head. "I don't know that I would want my wife knowing exactly what I'm feeling or thinking," the face said with a doubtful expression. "And knowing where you are, too, don't forget that," the Dev added. "But then again, my wife could control my every move just by slipping a little silver ring around my finger. And honestly, I would be fine with that. I know my wife wants what's best for me, and honestly, she's smarter than I'll ever be." The men burst out laughing, and Maz grinned, figuring the two men weren't a bad sort. He relaxed a little, more secure than ever now that the bond between him and Hollie was complete.
She would now be able to trust him because she could feel his emotions and sense his thoughts. She will now know my true feelings for her, and it will set us both free. Assuming the Fae Queen allows you to live in spite of your trespass and assault, how do you intend to keep your mate safe from your former master? I assume Samael isn't pleased that you are no longer under his thumb, despite having taken away your ability to travel. The Fae made a good point. I'm not sure. Hollie's hope was that we would remain out of the clutches of the Princes of Darkness and their powerful sister by taking shelter in your realm. The Queen is powerful, Bracken said. Don't get me wrong. She may be the most powerful Fae alive, but the Archons are on another level entirely, and I'm not certain she'll want to shelter the pair of you if it would mean harm to her people or destruction visited upon her realm. Maz nodded, knowing that he would feel similarly if he was the ruler of a realm. But that didn't keep him from hoping Bracken was wrong. Hollie trusted in the Fae, and she'd managed to carve out a fledgling relationship between them and a vampire. That in itself was a miracle. Maz would trust whatever came next, knowing it was Hollie's choice. It's time to put my faith in the Fae and friendship. It was a new thought to him, but one that filled him with an unaccustomed warmth. Maz grinned to himself, burying himself in the bond humming between himself and his mate, broadcasting his devotion through the distance between them and feeling the happiness that radiated back. Nothing is better than this. Even if Samael were to show up this second and rip my head off my neck, I would die a satisfied man, having experienced this bond with my mate. Chapter 21. Wow. Just wow. Sitting on a small sofa in the Fae Queen's private residence with Wendy by her side, Hollie was still in a daze, adjusting to the new normal of being bonded to the tall, handsome vampire. The distance between them was helping her mind to clear, but it had the strange effect of also making her longing for him a little more acute, a little more intense. She could feel his emotions vibrating through the invisible bond between them, and it was like nothing she'd ever experienced before. Hollie considered herself to be empathetic, and there were times with her father when they'd be able to finish each other's sentences, but this was next level compared to that sort of familiarity. Hollie could literally feel what the vampire was feeling: joy, pain, annoyance, acceptance. All of it was there, as if she herself were feeling it. At first it had been confusing, hence the feeling of drunkenness. But now that she was getting a handle on the experience, the bond between them was quickly becoming a thing of comfort.
I'm sure the Queen will be right along,
Taylor said, patting her hand. The Fae Human Studies scholar had appeared at the entrance to the royal family suites just as Hollie and the others had arrived. The Fae had been tipped off to the situation by one of the disgruntled Kingsblade and had hurried to the private section of the palace with an offer of help.
I'm fine,
Hollie told her with a broad smile.
In fact, I've never felt better.
It was amazing how much things had changed due to that single act. No wonder Maz was so insistent about sharing the bond. If I had known what I was fighting, I would have given in long ago. Phaedra muttered something under her breath where she stood behind the sofa. Hollie ignored her, not wanting anything to bring her down from the high she was currently floating on. A frizzle went through her, and an image appeared in her mind. It was fuzzy and not fully formed, but it showed an idealized version of herself. She was more beautiful than she'd ever felt, and the beatific smile on her face reminded her of a Renaissance painting. That's what he imagines when he thinks of me, she realized suddenly. The realization floored her, not only that she could sense when the vampire was thinking about her, but just how he saw her, better than she'd ever seen herself.
My daughters were insistent that I attend you, the Fae Queen said, sweeping into the room. What exactly is the cause for such urgency?
Gilly and Lena entered just behind their mother, their father a step behind them.
Mother, I've already told you. Hollie has tasted the vampire's blood. We want to make certain that it will have no ill effects on her.
Queen Elspeth looked slightly disturbed. She came to a stop in front of Hollie.
How did he trick you into such a heinous thing, child? She asked, her face full of concern. It's not like that, Hollie explained carefully, not wanting to upset the regent. I have fought against it for months now, but the truth is finally clear to me. Maz is my mate, and I am his.
It took completing the bond between us through the exchange of blood for me to accept it, but now that I have, I'm happy that I did."
Hollie stared out a semicircle of skeptical faces. "Child, we often fall into infatuations. It's hard not to when a male cuts a dashing figure and makes you all sorts of promises. But a promise made at midnight is often unfulfilled come the dawn."
"I understand," she said with a nod. "But in this instance, I have to respectfully disagree."
She put her hand over her heart, expression solemn.
"I can feel how he feels about me through the blood bond. I have no doubt of his affection for me."
In truth, what Maz was broadcasting through the bond was much deeper than affection. There was no other way to describe it. It was love. Pure, powerful love that radiated through her, filling her with light and hope. Vampires might be creatures of darkness, but not this one. He loves me, unconditionally and uncontrollably. It was a heady feeling, an intense feeling, this knowledge that a powerful immortal vampire was head over heels for a silly human, which was what she considered herself to be. What was more impressive was that he'd sacrificed everything he'd known, everything he was, in favor of loving her. It was overwhelming, and Hollie had to force herself not to wallow in the bond and the emotions it created.
"Your Majesties, I appreciate everyone's concern, and you have no idea how grateful I am to your daughters and you both. But I assure you, I'm fine, and Maz won't do anything to harm any Fae nor the realm. You can let him go."
The Fae King shook his head, but his wife's expression was curious. She leaned in, lifting Hollie's face to hers and staring deeply into her eyes. A tingling feeling slid over her, making her hair stand on end. For a moment, Hollie thought she saw a horrible old crone in the Queen's place, but she blinked and the image was gone.
"She has not been poisoned or otherwise tainted," Queen Elspeth announced, straightening. "A woman has the freedom to choose who she loves," she added, moving back to stand beside her husband. "And when there are no good options, a queen can create the perfect mate for herself."
Turning to her daughters, she repeated that it was up to Hollie to love whomever she wanted.
"Just as you both were allowed to find mates that others would have considered unsuitable."
Lena blushed, but Gilly laughed. Their mother leaned in to kiss them each on the cheek.
"Invite your friend and her mate to stay as long as they like."
She turned to sweep out of the room, but Phaedra wasn't about to let her escape without trying to change her mind.
"Majesty," she said, rushing after her, "you don't understand the danger you're inviting. Not only is the vampire a menace, but his master is—"
The words trailed off as the Fae headed down the hallway and out of earshot.
"Well,"
Taylor said, a look of amazement on her face,
"this is surely something for the history books. A human and a vampire mated and bonded. Maybe I should pioneer the field of human-vampire relations."
Hollie laughed, amused by her friend's obsession with all things human.
"We'll be happy to give you an interview."
"And a wedding invite?"
she asked eagerly. Hollie didn't respond, hiding her feelings behind a grin. The suggestion of a wedding had caught her off guard, although she supposed it shouldn't have. She was finally willing to admit to herself that her feelings for Maz were real, and they weren't going away. I'm falling for him. She would have never taken the risk of tasting his blood if the fear of being separated from him wasn't greater than her fear of the change that came along with drinking from him. Things will never be the same, and honestly, I'm glad. I know he loves me. I can feel it in every fiber of my being, literally. Their relationship shouldn't work, but they'd made it this far already. Hollie had given up on too many things in her life. She'd given up on college and a career in the big city in favor of sticking around her small Wisconsin town. She'd given up on serious romantic relationships and on deep and abiding friendships, but now she was blessed with both. Hollie stood, stretching and feeling a bone-deep tiredness lying heavily on her.
"If it's all right with you guys, I would love to catch a cat nap, maybe preceded and followed by a big meal."
Taylor laughed and stood next to her, hugging her around the shoulder.
"You deserve both. I'm headed for the archives to work out a program of study for human-vampire relations."
She kissed Hollie on the cheek and rushed off, already talking to herself about her ideas. Gilly and Lena stared at one another, and Hollie wondered, not for the first time, if they were able to read one another's thoughts. Maybe the twin bond was like the mate bond. She wasn't certain, but the pair definitely shared an understanding that transcended the ordinary.
I suppose we could find some quarters for you and your mate, Gilly said after a moment. Of course we can, Lena said, reaching out to embrace the human. We'd love having you, and my mother is correct. None of us here have conventional relationships, but who wants conventional? Hollie laughed. I used to think I did, Lena nodded. At one point, I would have given anything to be normal, but normal is overrated, isn't it? Giving her a smile, Hollie then had to suppress a yawn. Okay, Gilly said, gently pulling Hollie away from the twin sister. This girl needs a nap, stat. We can talk all about our love lives later. Believe me, I have stories about my deaf husband that will turn your ears blue. I'm not sure I want to hear that, Lena said, laughing. Standing on either side of her, the twins each took one of Hollie's hands, and they set off, heading out of the royal apartments and toward one of the palace exits. Wendy rolled along behind them, still following the protocol that required him to remain by her side. Tell me something, Lena asked in hushed tones. What did it taste like? What did what taste like? Maz's blood? At the Fae's nod, Hollie considered the question. I wasn't really thinking about it at the time, but I guess the best answer would be complex. Like a really fancy wine or bitter coffee or dark chocolate even. Interesting, Gilly said. Maybe we should consider bottling some. Sounds like we could make a fortune. Must you always be so inappropriate? Lena asked in a huff, which made Hollie laugh. She eyed the guards that they passed as they walked out through a set of double doors and into an outside courtyard. Must you always be so reserved? Gilly countered. You used to be fun. I'm still fun, Lena said with a sniff. In fact, when we get back to the Fae's quarters, I'll make Bracken tell you about what happened last night. I thought we weren't talking about our love lives until after I had a nap, Hollie said, making both of the twins laugh. They were walking past a carefully curated garden on their way to the gate situated between a pair of tall hedges. Just a moment, Lena said, stopping them. She released Hollie's hand to bend down and pick a stunning white flower from one of the bushes. This will look lovely in your hair. Gilly, help me weave this in over her ear. The Fae twins set about decorating her hair with the blossom, and when they were finished, both stood back to look over their handiwork. Gorgeous, they breathed together, clapping their hands together in delight. Hollie smiled at them, relieved to have their blessings on her relationship with Maz. Her friends' opinions were important, and having their support meant the world to her. Without warning, a cloud covered the sun, and the courtyard turned colder. A sudden flurry of whispers erupted around her, then a sound like 1,000 invisible wings flapping. Oh no. Hollie's heart dropped, her body filling with fear. One moment she was in the sunny courtyard, and the next she stood at the bottom of a long stone wall. The floor around her was dry, thankfully, but she could make out furrows in the rock walls like fingernails or claws might make if someone were to try and climb out. Hello? She called up toward the hole far above her. In the red-tinted sky she could see 2 crescent moons. Is anyone there? A head appeared, leaning over the well and looking down at her. The face was a beautiful one, with raven tresses flanking pale, pretty features. Ah, there you are. It's about time you stopped by so we can continue our conversation. Nevroyal, oh no. She'd been caught by the Lady of Whispers, and this time there was no one to save her. Maz couldn't travel, and the Fae weren't blessed with the ability either. Besides, who would know where she was when Hollie didn't even know herself? Don't feel like talking? Nev asked after a moment. Maybe you prefer to go for a swim instead. There was a flash of lightning overhead, blinding Hollie for a moment. Before the torrential downpour began, water slapped at her, soaking into the ground beneath her until it was too much for the dirt. It began to rise around her feet, and Hollie could feel the fear tightening her chest. You can talk, Nev said, or you can drown. Your choice.
Chapter 22. A wave of anxiety broke over her, and Hollie realized it was coming through the bond. Maz was upset because she was upset, the vampire sensing her fear and reacting accordingly. His fright worried her, and she quickly worked to calm herself, sending that through the bond back at the vampire. He said he could sense when I was thinking about him, but Can he sense what I'm thinking about otherwise? Hollie wasn't certain, but she decided to give it a chance, focusing on an image of Neverell and hoping he would pick up on it and know what had happened. She felt his confusion, and then a moment later, blistering anger. Hollie had to force herself to ignore what was coming through the bond and focus on what was happening in the here and now. The water at her feet was climbing, and Hollie knew it wouldn't take long to fill up the well. Not at the rate it was coming down. "Please," she said, squinting up through the rain. "I've told you nothing but the truth. Please let me go." Laughter echoed down the well. "I must admit, I was surprised to find you alone and unguarded. Not even that nasty little leech to protect you. I was certain my brothers would keep a better eye on you." Hollie knew that begging wouldn't work, so she gave it up in favor of humor. "I have a penchant for getting myself out of impossible situations," she said, injecting some cockiness in her tone. "I really should say I have a penchant for getting myself into impossible situations." "For a human, you're more confident than you have any right to be. Humans are such a fragile sort," Nev said with a chuckle. "I admire a woman who knows her worth, but I do not tolerate liars." "If I were so fragile, how would I survive a relationship with a vampire?" Hollie replied. "I think you have me mistaken for someone else." Nev's grin vanished. "Enough banter. It's time to get down to business. Tell me what my brothers have planned for me." "You know, I've been wondering something since I left your little bubble realm. Among your collection of items there, we found several items related to babies and many depictions of twin infants. Now that I've met you, you don't seem the type to collect posters of babies styled along with cabbages or wearing ties and playing musical instruments." "What are you nattering on about?" Nev asked, unamused. "You're wasting precious time. The water is already past your knees." "What was with all those pictures of the twins? They're yours, aren't they?" Lightning flashed again at her question, and Hollie knew she'd hit a nerve. I don't even know why I'm asking these questions. She was killing time, trying to distract Nev long enough to be rescued, but Hollie knew that rescue wouldn't be coming, at least not in time to save her from whatever the dark woman had planned. "There is confidence, and then there is impertinence." Her voice had turned guttural, the red sky bleeding to black and the moons above disappearing. The rain still poured down, but now Hollie could barely make out her surroundings. "I'm right, aren't I?" Hollie shouted over the torrent. "Those are your children, which means you must have fallen in love once yourself, and undoubtedly loved your babies. As a mother, you must have mercy on those weaker and more defenseless than yourself. You dare to speak to me about mercy? About children?" The world around her rocked, and the water that was now at her waist began to surge upward, splashing toward her face. Hollie forced herself to remain calm, trying to float in the water. She could feel Maz's emotions through the bond, and the anger was still prevalent, but he was also sending a calm through the bond that she could use. Drawing on his calm, she began to tread the water that kept rising. "At this rate, I can ride it to the top and have this messed up conversation face to face." Hollie wasn't sure how she hit on this strategy, but she was going all in on it now. Talking about her children seemed to unsettle the woman. While it was infuriating, it was also distracting her from asking questions that Hollie couldn't answer. Every second she was able to stall was a second added to her life. "Where are your children now?" she called. "They must be powerful creatures in their own right, and you must care for them greatly, or you wouldn't have kept souvenirs like their locks of hair and baby teeth in your little bubble realm." "I will torture you for this, you know that." Nev's voice was calmer, but Hollie could still sense the thread of rage underneath. "My children are none of your business." "So they are yours." "Thought so." Hollie smiled up through the rain, hoping the woman could see it. The water was splashing around her, and it was getting more difficult to keep herself on the surface. Below the water, her legs were kicking furiously to stay afloat. She was running out of sassy things to say, and water was splashing into her mouth at regular intervals, making it hard to speak at all. "Has your little cocky streak run its course?" Nev shouted. "Are you ready to tell me the truth about my brothers?"
Happily, but maybe we could talk somewhere where I wasn't in danger of drinking untreated well water, she choked. Nev let out a growl, and suddenly the water vanished. Hollie hit the ground hard, but it was no longer a dirt floor beneath her. It was smooth as glass and shimmery. She felt a thread of alarm through the bond at her wince of pain, so she sent as much reassurance to Maz as she could. Picking herself up off the floor, Hollie looked around her. She seemed to be in a sphere of sorts, with opaque shimmering walls. This doesn't seem so bad, she thought, moving to press some of the water out of her hair. That's when she realized she wasn't wet. "Which of my brothers do you serve?" The voice boomed around her, so loud that it knocked her down again. Hollie grunted and covered her ears with her hands, but the question continued on a loop, repeated over and over with a volume that just seemed to increase. "I don't serve any of them." "Then why did you arrive on Pluto shortly after my brother fled from Nyx?" "I had no choice." Hollie stuck her fingers in her ears, waiting for the booming response. It did not come immediately, so slowly she cleared her ears and stood again. She reached one of the walls and pressed against it, but nothing happened. It turned out that there wasn't even a wall there. Hollie extended her arms to reach what looked like a wall, but it was an optical illusion that seemed to leap back a few feet as she walked forward. "What does Samael have planned for me?" boomed the voice again suddenly, and Hollie stumbled. "I told you I don't know. I don't work for him. I only went to Pluto because he vowed to protect me from you." "Lies!" Nev hissed, and this time Hollie screamed in pain. Her eardrums were vibrating hard, and she was afraid they would burst if this kept up. Anxiety vibrated through the bond again, a split second before the comforting calm. Hollie knew it was costing the vampire a lot to keep sending positive emotions to her. He must be terrified for me, she realized, and beyond frustrated at how helpless he is to save me. That thought was sobering, but there was nothing Hollie could do to turn things around. She was trapped in this shimmering world where the only thing that seemed to exist was Nevroil's thunderous questions. Real fear filled her, and Hollie knew she was as close to death as she'd ever been. Nev wasn't pleased with the answer she was giving, and it would be only so long before her frustration and anger overwhelmed her patience. There was a genuine chance that, this time, she'd die at the Dark Woman's hand with no one coming to rescue her. Hollie swallowed hard and focused on the bond. Through it she sent all of her feelings for the vampire. Love, gratitude, desire, all of them flowed from her through their blood bond. It was her version of a farewell, the best she could manage in this situation. She could feel Maz then, his emotions in a whirl. He seemed to sense what she was doing, and an image appeared in her mind, an image of the two of them in an embrace. Tears started to flood her eyes. She wondered if it was Maz's way of telling her goodbye as well. When the next question came, she squatted low, covering her ears and resting her head on her knees, waiting for the echo to grow loud enough to shake her body to pieces. She wished she had a chance to see her friends again and tell them how grateful she was to have met each of them. The Fae had been lifesavers more than once, and she'd never met finer. Wendy was one of the best friends she'd ever had, despite their short period of acquaintance. And her father. Sobs started to make her tremble, grief at losing her father again. She was thankful for the extra time she's gotten with him, but it didn't make saying goodbye any easier. And then there was Maz. Hollie hadn't thought she'd get a chance at a real romance, especially one so intense and full of adventure. They'd only just gotten past many of the things that had kept them apart. If it weren't for the pesky Darkness family and their stupid apocalypse, we might have had a chance. "Goodbye, my love," she whispered in her heart, as the echoes grew loud enough to draw blood from her ears. "I hope that you can find a way to go on without me, to find love again." Maz had mentioned that mates meant eternity together, or forever apart, and that you only got one chance, but for his sake, she hoped that was wrong. Maz deserved love, if not from her, then someone else like her. She closed her eyes and waited for the end, grateful to have been given the chance to experience all that she had since leaving Earth. I wouldn't trade meeting my friends if I could, and I certainly wouldn't miss the chance to fall in love with Maz. Suddenly the echoes stopped at the sound of a pleasant melodic chime.
Hollie lifted her head to see the wall in front of her start to swirl, as well as shimmer. A shadow appeared inside the wall, then suddenly stepped out. Hollie gasped in shock, which radiated through the bond to the vampire. Her despair lightened, even though she had no idea how the newcomer's appearance would alter the situation. Things just got interesting. Chapter 23. An arm with gray-scaled skin reached down to her, holding out a hand. Hollie hesitated a moment before accepting it, but she eventually let the demon lift her to her feet. "You found me," she said, surprised, then set to wiping at the blood teeming from her ears. "I did," he said with a solemn nod. "Your companion pinpointed the realm with near-perfect accuracy. It only took a few tries to reach this place." The eye looked around appraisingly, then froze when his gaze seemed to settle on something. "There you are," he said, seemingly talking to nothing. "Looking instead of welcoming your guest. I guess your legendary lack of hospitality is true after all." The world around Hollie seemed to shift, the opaque walls turning silver, and suddenly she could see her reflection. The room around her changed, and now there were pieces of furniture, paintings, and decorations, and one irate-looking lady in black. "I'm back in the bubble," Hollie realized, slowly catching on to what was happening. The eye followed Wendy's coordinates and found the bubble. That means all of this was an illusion. She was annoyed at being caught up in the false worlds that Nev Royal had the power to create. "Who are you?" Nev demanded, her expression near feral. "How did you get in here?" The dark lady was visibly bristling, irate at her privacy being invaded again. "I just know she's going to blame me for this," Hollie thought, praying that the eye had enough power to at least fight the woman to a standstill. The eye, for his part, ignored her words. He strolled around the pocket realm, looking things over. Hollie's gaze followed him, as did Nev's, as he wandered around the room, ignoring them both. He paused before an ebony frame sitting on a small table. The frame held a chalk drawing of two infants, their chubby limbs bare. They were laughing, their little bodies drawn in a casual style that seemed to accent their cuteness. The demon picked up the frame and inspected it, some of his stiffness seeming to vanish. Nev, however, wasn't happy about being ignored. The realm around them began to shake, and once again her voice boomed out, loud as thunder in a gym locker. "Who are you? How did you get in here?" Hollie slapped her hands over her ears and grimaced in pain, but the eye showed no reaction at all. He turned the frame around to point the drawing at Nev. "Who are these two little charmers?" he asked her, as casually as if he were asking her the time of day. Nev's jaw dropped. Her face went red, her temper exploding. "You have no right to ask that, and zero right to be here." Lifting her delicate-looking hands, she scowled at the demon. "I will banish you to a realm where you will spend the rest of your long life being slowly skinned alive." The eye stared at her, a look of sadness arriving on his features. He let out a long breath, then hung his head. "As you wish, Mother." The word hung between them, and Hollie moved back, tucking herself as out of the way as she could while the exchange continued between the pair. Nev froze at the word, her eyes wide. "Which one of them sent you?" she hissed after a moment, her expression furious. "Was it Samael? That seems like him. He was always the cruelest of my brothers." "I was sent by no one," the eye told her, his chin held high. "Samael will pay for this," she threatened, ignoring his response. "I know all of this is just another one of his power games. Even when we were children, as short of a period that was, coming up under Shayatan's not-so-gentle tutelage, Samael would always find ways to trick and belittle us. It was endless fun for my brother, not so much for the rest of us." She stared the demon down, her expression haughty. Hollie admired her strength in that moment. Confronted with the chaos her world had become, Nev Royal maintained a singular focus. Still, at some point, the woman's certainty would have to break, and she would have to confront the truth. "No one sent me," the eye repeated, a hint of sadness in his tone. "I have spent an eternity trying to find you, but you have not made it easy." The dark lady seemed at a loss for words. Hollie could see her struggle written on her features. She feared being tricked and was angry that her family would even try to trick her and
disdainful of the visitor and his invasion. But beneath it all, barely visible, was a spark of hope. She wants it to be true, Hollie realized. "What is Samael planning?" she asked, and Hollie wanted to groan in frustration. "He thinks he can fool me with a fake son? Tell your master to do better," she said, lifting her hands again. Hollie could see them crackling with energy. "If you survive to tell Samael anything." Bracing herself for the attack, Hollie hugged herself, watching to see what happened next. The eyes stood there, staring at Nev, while she stared back at him. The lightning continued to crackle at her fingertips, but she didn't loose it. Instead, she studied the demon's face. "Kiamad?" she said softly, her voice breaking on a sob. "Can it really be you?" "It is, Mother, though I have not gone by that name in a very long time." Nev Royal let out a cry and lunged forward, wrapping her arms around the demon. Hollie held in a gasp at the change in events, on the edge of her seat. The eye allowed himself to be hugged, but some of his stiffness remained. After a moment, Nev released him and took a step back. "It's been so long," she murmured, still in shock. "My baby!" She raised her hand to stroke his hair. "What have they done to you?" she asked in dismay. It felt as if Hollie had intruded on a scene too personal to be watched by spectators, but she had no choice but to witness things as they unfolded. It was clear that Nev now accepted that the demon was one of the twin babies in the chalk drawing. Reflecting on her recent reunion with her own father, Hollie knew how the two of them must feel. To see one another after all hope of reuniting was lost. They should have been celebrating, but that was not the case. Something still hung between them, something that was preventing a happy reunion. "You never came for me," the demon said after a moment, and Hollie could tell it wasn't easy for him to say it at all. "All those years, waiting for a mother who never came." The faraway expression on his features finished the story that his words had started. Nev Royal had abandoned her own children so many years ago, and the pain lingered even now. What about the other child? Hollie couldn't help but wonder. Did Nev abandon him too? Is there another one-eyed demon out there, trying to fight his way back to her? The dark lady seemed to break down in front of them, the careful defenses she'd spent eons erecting finally starting to crumble. "I'm sorry," she cried, tears streaming from her eyes. "I truly am. You have no idea how long I've been searching for you, Kai. But you were too well hidden." "That's funny," he said in a voice that proclaimed it was anything but. "I was looking for you. You were looking for me, and yet neither of us managed to find one another. Why do you think that is, Mother?" Nev let out a long sigh. "It was the hardest decision I ever had to make," she told him, "and one I have regretted every moment since." She did not continue her explanation, instead reaching to gently touch his eye patch. "What has happened to you?" The eye allowed her to move his patch aside, exposing the scarred-over patch where his eye had once been. Although the demon's features were sharp and mean before, the removal of the patch made things exponentially worse. Hollie held back her revulsion at his appearance, knowing better than to judge a person for their appearance, even a demon. "Who dared to take my son's eye?" Nev cried, anger filling her once more. She seemed to swell up, the realm around her starting to shiver. Hollie knew that she was gearing up to exact some revenge, and for a moment felt pity for whoever faced her wrath. "I did, Mother," the eye revealed, almost seeming to enjoy his mother's gasp in response. "I gave up my eye in sacrifice. It garnered me the ability to see what I needed to see, in order to find you again." He adjusted the patch once more and stared down at her, a grim expression on his gray features. "Find you, and perhaps punish you for abandoning your own child."
Chapter 24. Hollie looked from Nev Royal to the eye and back again, waiting for a response to the not-so-veiled threat the demon had just made to his mother. She knew that he had good reason for hating his mother, but Hollie pitied them both, wondering if there was a way to move beyond their pasts. If Maz and I can do it, maybe they can too, she thought, biting her lip and attempting to keep the lowest of profiles. She didn't want either of them to remember she was lurking here, lest they both decide that no witness were better. "I never wanted to separate you," Nev said at last, falling into an armchair and leaning back, staring up at the mirrored dome ceiling. "It was the only thing I could do back then. I had just given birth a week before, and then it happened." Nev rubbed a tired hand over her face. "At first, we brushed it off, figuring it was nonsense. It was a goblin shaman, after all, and we all know what goblins are like. The prophecy was garbled, but parts of it were clear enough. Evil's only daughter will bring about Big Bad One's demise, her identical babes ushering in the beginning of the ending." She sighed, and Hollie could sense how tired she must be, having carried this weight through eons. There was only one daughter they could have been talking about, but we figured it was some nonsense cooked up by those who were jealous of our blessings. "Likely one of my brothers," she added. "You know which one." Samael, Hollie thought, but didn't venture to say out loud. But soon it wasn't only the goblins who were talking about prophecy involving Shayatin's daughter and her twins bringing down the adversary of old. There were 3 other races with a similar prophecy, and one with a slight variant. Shayatin wasn't the target. The Fae were. Hollie swallowed hard, having already known about the Fae plot, cooked up by Edda, the Fae Prince of Valentia, who was horribly jealous of his youngest sister. He changed the prophecy to fit his own needs, using it to force his sister's banishment from Valencia so he could rule without impediment. Despite the variation in theme, almost every other sign pointed to me being the subject of the prophecy. I was going to bring down Shayatin, the most powerful force of evil in the multiverse, and my own creator. Not just that, but the father of my mate and the grandfather of the twin boys I'd just birthed. You can understand the chaos of those times. The eye didn't respond. He continued staring her down, allowing her to give her version of events. "Your father was agitated, as could be expected given how his father was breathing down his neck. I began to fear what would happen with my babies and myself, given that we were now the greatest threat in the web." Nev wiped a tear from her eyes. "I had hoped Az would stand up for me, that he would offer protection, but all he would say was that everything would unfold according to his father's will. I knew then that he would never go against Shayatin. I was on my own, the sole protector of my 2 infant boys." Hollie hung on every word, wondering how it would feel to be so bereft. This woman had to sacrifice her relationship with her mate in order to protect her children. She couldn't imagine how that would feel, and a little sympathy for the dark woman kindled to life in her chest. "I had the idea to separate you then, knowing that your father would be looking for us. If we were all together, then none of us would survive whatever Shayatin had in store. But by separating you boys, I thought at least one of you might make it." "How did you choose?" Hollie turned her head to take in the eye, his voice gruff. The question was a heavy one, and Hollie almost wished she didn't have to hear the answer. "I could not choose," Nev admitted, her voice breaking again. "How could a mother choose between 2 children she loved more than anything? I laid that burden on Edvinia, my loyal servant, and your nursemaid." The eye twitched at the mention of the nursemaid, but he didn't speak. He continued to stare at his mother, wanting all the sordid details. "She did not tell me which one of you she'd chosen to spirit away," Nev admitted. "It wasn't until she was gone with you, tucked within a hex carrier for your safety, that I discovered it was your brother she'd left with me. He has a small, star-shaped birthmark on his right thigh. Yours is on your left." The eye nodded. "So it was not your choice to send me away?" Nev shook her head. "Edvinia took you. We'd made a plan, and I had insisted that she not tell me when she would go, because I knew I would try and stop her. Believe me, letting you go was harder than anything I had experienced then or now. One night I returned from trying once more to convince your father to resist Shayatin, and Jai was there alone, your bassinet empty. That's when I knew Edvinia had carried out her part of the plan." "I prayed endlessly for your safety," she told him. "But I knew that Edvinia loved you as much as I did. She would take care of you, keep you safe, and love you even though I couldn't be there to do those things." "She died," the demon interrupted, plunging the atmosphere of the room into an ice bath. "When I was still an infant, or so I've been told. She'd been forced to stop on a realm in the Outer Rim, a seedy place filled with brutes and robbers. Once she was gone, those same brutes and robbers raised me, if you could call it that." "No," Nev whispered, not wanting to believe it. "I never knew she passed. I had hoped she would protect you well into adulthood." "There was no one to protect me," the eye said, his voice low, his tone full of pain. and I swore to myself that I would find you, that I would make you answer for what happened to me. But you had vanished, and by the time I had enough power to really search for you, you had become like a myth, a legend that never existed. I looked for you, she told him through her sobs. I tried desperately to find you. Once your brother had reached maturity and been trained to hold his own against fellows like your cursed uncles, I searched for you, but no one had ever heard of you, nor seen a man matching your description. Because I no longer looked like my brother, I assume, he said. Life had been rough on me, and I had the scars and wounds that proved it. I imagine Jai still has his both eyes. Nev let out a wail, and Holly's heart ached for the woman. She couldn't hold back any longer.
Go to her, she advised the demon. She never meant to hurt you. You must understand that. She only did what she thought was best to protect you.
The eye looked at Holly for a moment, and she wasn't sure if he was going to follow her advice. He was trembling, his face paler than before, and Holly realized this confrontation wasn't going as he'd planned either.
Love is stronger than the hate you feel, she whispered. Let it go, and you can have your mother back.
Those last words seemed to have an effect, and the demon staggered forward. He dropped to his knees in front of Nev's chair and rested his face on her lap, throwing his arms around her. Nev gripped him tightly, crooning apologies and holding him close, rocking her long-lost child back and forth. It was a touching scene, and Holly couldn't help the tears that fell from her eyes. She felt Maz questioning her through the bond, probably confused by her shifting emotions. She sent relief through the bond in reply as well as hope. They held each other, and it was as if the years between them began to melt away. When the eye pulled himself together and rose, he looked decades younger, his gray complexion regaining some healthy color. Nev rose next to him, seemingly not ready to part with her son so soon after rediscovering him. Having you back is the greatest thing that could have happened to me, she said, joy shining from her beautiful features. Nev cupped his cheeks and smiled up at him, and Holly could feel the love radiating from her to the demon. He smiled back, the first time Holly had seen him grin, and it transformed his face. She caught a glimpse of the handsome man he could have been if life hadn't dealt so roughly with him. I guess there is redemption even for the worst of us, Holly thought. It was something of a miracle watching the daughter of what was essentially the devil on steroids reconnect with a demon who'd plucked out his own eye in an evil rite just to get revenge on her. It was a big enough surprise when Maz turned out not to be an evil blood-sucking leech, she thought, grinning. But this transformation is in a class all by itself. Mother, the eye said after a long moment, our guest is probably tired and likely wants to go home now.
Guest?
She said hastily, as if waking from a dream. The human, he reminded her gently. I believe that she's telling the truth about not helping Samael. It was an honest mistake, her landing here. Or more accurately, it was fate bringing us back together. We should be thanking her, not punishing her. Holly held her breath, hoping that his mother would see it the same way that he did. Nev looked at her, studying her for a moment before nodding her head. I have done you a great wrong, she said, inclining her head in Holly's direction. I hope that one day you can forgive me for my mistake.
Already forgiven, Holly hurried to say. As long as I can get that ride home your son mentioned.
Nev chuckled, shaking her head.
Always a cheeky one. You can have your ride back to your vampire, and I'll do you one better. I know about that little block my brother placed on his vampire servant. By way of an apology, I will remove it for him.
Thank you, Holly said, pressing her palms together. Excitement flooded her, and she could feel it bounce back at her through the bond.
I'm coming back to you, my love.
You'll come with me? Nev asked her son, a little hint of anxiety in her voice. I would hate to be separated from you so soon. You're not going to have to worry about that, the eye said with a grin, placing her arm through his. It's going to take a hells of a lot to drag me away from you any time soon. The demon reached out his hand to Holly, and she took it, waiting for the whoosh that would bring her back to her adopted home. A moment later, she found herself back in the eye's quarters, surrounded by her friends. Gasps went up, and her friends prepared to defend themselves, but Holly stuck 2 fingers in her mouth and whistled loudly. No one move! She shouted, hoping they had enough trust in her to obey. Maz was at her side in a second, protecting her from the threat he saw Nev and the eye to be. Please, everyone listen, Holly said frantically. She quickly explained what had happened since she'd vanished, hoping that her friends would believe the unbelievable. Phaedra's eyes were glued on Nevriel. You almost killed me back on Nyx. I get that a lot, Nev admitted. I did not know you were friends of my son. Lena shook her head. This is a lot to take in. Her sister nodded. It is. But it makes sense. The prophecy is about her, not her mother. She turned to Nev, her expression serious. What about the prophecy? Has it been set in motion? Not yet, Nev said with a sigh. But now I have my son back. It won't be long until circumstances conspire to bring about its fulfillment. A strange expression appeared on her face. But maybe I won't wait for fate to push me into that position. We know Shaitan deserves what's coming to him. Phaedra shook her head, her eyes saying that she'd been forced to accept too many changes in too short a time. I guess the only thing we can say is, go Apocalypse? There were a few nervous laughs, and they served to break the tension. Folks seemed to no longer believe they were about to duel to the death, and relief flooded Hollie. She fell into Maz's arms and let him hold her, content at last. It is time for us to go, Nevriel told them. But before we do, I have a parting gift for the pair who helped reunite me with my lost child. She addressed Hollie, her expression open for the first time. There is an artifact, created and lost long ago, that bestows eternal life on its owner. It is not cursed, and it would not make you sacrifice your humanity to remain with your eternal mate. It will be hard to find, but a woman as enterprising and tenacious as you won't give up until she has it in her possession. I wish you luck. With that, Nevriel vanished, the eye going with her. The threat that had forced her into Samael's grip was gone now, and Hollie knew that nothing else could stand in the way of their future together. Chapter 25. Maz was exhausted, his strength barely carrying him anymore, but Hollie in his arms again, the blood bond singing between them, revitalized him in a way nothing else could. He wanted to carry her away to someplace private to explore this change between them, to promise her his eternal love and devotion. I know, Hollie said, smiling up at him. I want that too, but we have to be polite to our friends. Maz grinned, infatuated by the bond between them, and the new understanding that made everything so much easier between them. He nodded, then listened as she answered the questions her friends peppered her with. Did we just make friends with the daughter of the devil himself? Lena asked, confused. Gilly nodded. I think so. And one of the harbingers of the great annihilation, she added, quoting the prophecy. Are you sure you're okay? The question came from her father, Wendy having rolled up and tugged on her dress. I'm sure, Dad, she told him gently, patting Wendy on the head.
We were forced to violate protocol, Wendy confessed. I'm afraid I couldn't come with you when Nev took you. Maz released Hollie so she could crouch next to the bot. Are you okay, Wendy? Did the protocol breach cause a problem with your programming?
Curiously, it did not, he admitted. I believe it's because I'm out of Gresh's proximity, but I would rather not push my luck. I plan to stick close to you from now on.
Good, Hollie said, grinning. I want to keep my father and my best friend by my side always. Maz held back a groan at her words, wanting her all to himself, but the emotion still transferred via the bond. Hollie laughed, looking up at him. Okay, almost always, she corrected. Phaedra held up her hand to gain the group's attention. All right, everyone. There's been plenty of excitement today already. Why don't we all return to the palace just to be safe, where the king and queen's magic is strongest? No one disagreed, so they headed down out of the tower where the Eye's former quarters were, and across several courtyards to reach the Fae royal palace. On arrival, Maz was surprised to hear Phaedra suggest that they find a nice quiet place for him and Hollie to rest. Lena and Gilly agreed, and the twins led them to a large suite of rooms. You should have plenty of space and privacy here, Lena announced, smiling at the pair of them, and you can stay as long as you like. So please, consider this a little honeymoon. I suppose I could get used to this, Hollie said, winking at Maz, if this is the biggest suite you have. Gilly laughed, giving her mate a playful shove. You never stop, do you, facing down the Princess of Darkness all alone, and you've still got energy left for your customary size. Hollie shrugged a shoulder. I guess that's just who I am. Maz could sense her feelings, the realization that she was stronger now than she had been when she'd left Earth. I'm not the only one who's been changed because of our meeting. Okay, everyone, time to get out of here and give them space, Phaedra said, moving to shoo the others out of the room. Wendy let out an alarmed whistle, and the winged Fae laughed. Not you, of course, but there is a nice adjoining room where you can rest and, I don't know, run some sort of diagnostics.
I will,
Wendy said, pink lights cascading inside his dome.
I will run several diagnostics and test my system for faults.
Thanks for the idea, Phaedra, Frank said sarcastically. Diagnostics are exactly how I love to spend my afternoons. The bot ignored Hollie's father and rolled to the door, disappearing out of view. Phaedra turned back to them when they were alone. I'd like to talk to Hollie briefly, she said, then tugged on his mate's arm, pulling her to the side of the room. He heard them easily, thanks to his supernatural abilities, but he pretended for their sakes that he could not. Are you certain that you want to accept the leech as your mate? Phaedra asked softly. Although vamps might have fated mates, humans do not, as you've pointed out before. I know, Hollie said, giving Phaedra a hug, and I appreciate your concern, but I love him. Simple as that. Maz's eyes cut to the Fae's face to see her reaction. Phaedra looked as if she'd swallowed something distasteful, and it took everything inside him not to laugh. But, hoping to foster a good relationship with all of Hollie's friends, he held his tongue. Maz was surprised when the warrior woman approached him, expecting her to treat him with her customary disdain. You know I'm not a fan of your kind. In fact, I've spent most of my life hunting and staking creatures of your sort. But I respect you for standing up to the princes, and if Hollie wants you, then I will have to accept that. Shock flooded him, and for a moment the vampire wasn't sure how to respond. Then Phaedra stuck out her hand, and he took it, giving it a firm shake. I will do everything in my power to protect her, and I will always cherish her. I know you will, Phaedra said, her characteristic demeanor returning, because if you don't, you'll have me on your hands. Phaedra, remember that privacy you were mentioning earlier? Hollie interrupted with a yawn. How about we get that started now? Fair enough, Phaedra said with a chuckle. We can talk more soon. Until then, get some rest, you two. She vanished out the door, closing it behind her. Hollie sighed and fell into Maz's arms, and he happily caught her. At long last, I'm alone with my beloved. Maz brushed back a lock of her hair and stared into her eyes, overwhelmed with gratitude at the way things had resolved themselves. She was his and he was hers, and at last they had the chance to get to know one another without a steady stream of danger breathing down their necks. Leaning in to kiss her, he froze just before his lips touched hers. The sound of a slow clap caused him to act on instinct, pivoting to put himself between Hollie and whatever had appeared now to prolong their absence of privacy. Looks like you've got everything you wanted wrapped up in a nice little bow. Samael's voice was cold, but his face was a mask of glee. Let me be the first to congratulate you, he said, clapping again. Somehow you managed not only to escape, but to discover the coordinates of a certain realm. Coordinates I demanded, and you swore you couldn't produce. Get out of here, Samael, Maz growled, his rage close to bursting off its leash. You are not welcome here. The Angel of Death ignored him. I know you had a little help getting off Pluto, and don't worry. Dallin will be punished. But his punishment will be nothing compared to what I do to your supposed mate. Samael rounded on Hollie, but Maz acted on instinct, attempting to teleport, forgetting that his powers were blocked. He was surprised to find that his ability worked, and he appeared between Samael and his mate, blocking the prince from his prey. That's a neat trick, Samael snarled. It seems I'll have to reinforce my punishment. Samael snapped his finger, then used his own ability to teleport on the other side of Hollie and make a grab for her. Maz acted fast, traveling again to once more put himself between the two of them. The prince didn't bother to disguise his anger. It seems the link between us has been severed, he said after a moment, his expression murderous. And I suppose I have my sister to thank for that. You do, Hollie said haughtily, crossing her arms over her chest. You might as well move along, Samael, because you're not welcome here. He cocked a brow at her words. Is that so? Well, little human, I'm afraid you have no idea what's in store for you. You broke our vow, and that means you are subject to the multiverse law governing vows. You can expect a punishment of untold magnitude. Maz felt fear radiating through the bond and put an arm around his mate. Is that so? He said in a casual tone. So why hasn't it happened yet? The multiverse takes its time, Samael said, but the vampire could hear the doubt in his tone. Just you wait. I think you're wrong, he said, confidence filling his tone. The vow was that she would stay with you while she was in danger from Nevriel. But your sister is no longer a threat to her. If anything, she and Hollie are friends now, so it looks like your threats are empty. You tread on perilous ground, leech, Samael warned. Be careful lest you find yourself on the wrong side of the coming war. Any side that you're on is the wrong side, Maz growled, letting his temper go. Now depart before the rulers of this realm realize that there is a viper in their midst. Until we meet again, leech, Samael said, his stare cold. The prince vanished, and Hollie clung to Maz, relief radiating through their bond. Where were we? He asked, smiling at her. Oh, yeah, we were here. Maz pressed his lips against hers, losing himself in the kiss. He could feel her pleasure pulsing through the bond, and it only heightened his own until he was close to breaking. Coming up for air, he cupped her cheek. I love you, he told her, his tone ringing with sincerity. I know, she said with a grin. I can feel it. She put a hand over her heart, then another on his. And I love you more than I thought possible. He smiled, kissing her again. Maz had once thought his future consisted of nothing more than a long life spent alone, with no direction and no hope for anything more. But Hollie had shown him that he deserved so much more than that. Maz couldn't wait to build that future together with her. It seemed that anything was possible now, especially given Nev's information about the artifact. If we could truly spend eternity together, then I will fill it with so much love, so much devotion that Hollie will never again experience the loneliness she had before. I will spend eternity showing her how perfect she is, but now I need to taste her again. He kissed her, and he knew he'd never get tired of the feel of her lips against his. The pleasure reverberated through the bond, growing and growing, just like his heart had grown since meeting his mate. Now I have the rest of eternity to love her. Better get started. Epilogue. He had dwelt in this place of obsidian and black sapphire and amethyst for as long as he could remember. It was a gift, this place, one of many from his father. He was certain it was priceless, the hundreds of thousands of gems embedded in its structure sparkling brightly to proclaim the endless wealth of the heir to equally endless power. Over the millennia, the place had been filled with guests. Once it had rung to the rafters with noise and activity, but for many centuries now it had been a place of quiet refuge, a place to come when the memories haunted him, a place where I can wallow in my loneliness. Years had passed in which he tried to forget. He tried to lose himself in adventure, in a woman, in several women, in anything that might make him remember what it was like to be whole. But each had lost their appeal as time passed. Now he preferred to be on his own. He welcomed the loneliness, sought it, embraced it. If not for the loneliness, he would not know that he was still alive. He walked the black-sheened corridor this day feeling like any other, until it didn't. The familiar cold flame burned his insides, and he paused, surprised that he was being summoned after so long on his own. A moment later, his bleak yet sumptuous surroundings were gone, replaced by a haze of smoke and the smell of sulphur. Around him sat a ring of blue flames that rose higher than he stood. It was a cold fire, a fire that would have frozen him if he weren't already used to it. He knew where he was, but not how he felt about being there. Lifting his eyes above him, he met the gaze of the towering figure, cloaked in smoke and shadow that lurked in the darkness outside the ring. That gaze was one of orange flames and madness. The creature smiled, a row of razor-sharp fangs that held no warmth. "It has been a long time, the creature said, his voice like shattered glass, its booming bouncing off the cavern walls in the darkness around him. How is my only son?" He knew his father would not summon him for small talk alone. "What has happened, father?" he asked, wasting no time in the hopes of making for a short business. He already missed his home and the embrace of his loneliness. The towering creature chuckled, a sound that grated on even his own son's nerves. Smoke billowed from its nostrils, the smell of brimstone increasing. "The moment we have been waiting for is at hand. Ready yourself for what is to come." His father had always been the sort to get straight to the point, a characteristic that Az appreciated. "Are you certain?" he asked, already knowing the answer. I am. Az could tell he was about to be dismissed, and nothing in him wanted to linger, but he was still coming to grips with what this news would mean. Perhaps the loneliness I've grown so fond of has run its course. Go. Prepare, Shaitan told him by way of a farewell. Az nodded, about to teleport back to his own palace. And say hello to your mate for me, his father said just before he left, the words echoing in Az's brain. He landed back in the same corridor from whence he'd come, but there was no loneliness waiting for him there. His body felt different, disturbed in some way, tingling with the knowledge that the time of the prophecy was finally at hand. It was time to face the decisions he'd made long ago, decisions that had brought him to this moment. He would reap the consequences of those actions soon, and in a way, he was looking forward to the pain that was headed his way. All those years ago, I had to decide how my eternity would play out. I was still young then, having only had a few centuries of life. Was I really in a position to make such a consequential choice? Whether he was or not, he'd had to live with the fallout of his decision ever since. But now there would be a true reckoning. Now was the moment where his devotion to his father was to reach its ultimate peak. And yet that devotion hadn't seemed to serve him as well as he'd hoped over the millennia. If anything, he'd fallen out of favor with his father, who hadn't summoned him in over 1,000 years. Shaitan was not a typical father, Az knew, which meant he couldn't be held to the standards of others. He was one of a kind, but perhaps not the best kind. He was about to turn around to head back to his bedroom and pull out the only possession he had left that meant anything to him. But before he could move a step, he heard a sound that he had not heard in ages. The creaking of the front door. Az teleported to the entry hall, its towering ceiling coming to an arch above him, the wide double doors coming to their own point as well. He stood there, waiting for his guest to enter, except she wasn't a guest. Not exactly. The doors swung open, and in she walked, attired in black silk, her face as lovely as the day she'd left him, if not more so. She walked right in as if she still owned the place, giving him a nod, not at all surprised to find him there to greet her. "Did you miss me?" she asked him, her smile sharp. Then she laughed, a sound that was something out of a nightmare. Fear filled him, and Az wondered if maybe the loneliness was better after all. The end. This has been Dark Memories, Fae Wilds Series, Vampire Tales, Book 9, written by W.J. May, narrated by Kathleen Starr Hall.